The blonde guy and his partner are out there fighting for their lives. The Ferris family of the Hamel Kingdom has been around since before the country even started, making them a house with a serious pedigree. Though out here in the eastern region of the continent known as Ilva, things are a lot tougher than they look on paper. There's an old saying that the poor always have a ton of kids, and it turns out that even the blue bloods can't escape that rule. Because while the Ferris family has all that history and tradition, they're really just a low-ranked knightly house sitting at the bottom of the noble ladder. The guy's paycheck should be enough to support 8 adults, but almost all of it goes toward maintaining the fake image of being a fancy noble, and the costs that come with being the captain of the guard aren't cheap either. Just looking at the two of them, they're already burning through 7 portions of food just to keep everyone fed. But the budget is already completely maxed out with just 2 kids in the picture. It makes you wonder how many brothers and sisters are actually in this family, and the reality is pretty wild. The Ferris family actually has 12 kids to look after. The family staff is totally stressed out looking at the bills, and it's pretty clear they still don't have enough money to get by. So the protagonist starts thinking about his sister Hannah, who's stuck and can't get married without a dowry. He looks at his other sister Lilia and decides he can't let her carry this burden, while she just looks up and calls out to him. He makes up his mind right then. He's going to protect the family he loves even if he has to ditch his noble status, which is why he decides to become an adventurer. It's all for his siblings, and he knows if anyone is going to save this bankrupt household, he's the guy who has to go out and earn the cash, so he heads straight over to the big wooden building where the guild is located. Walking through the front doors, he stops for a second to just take the whole place in. The guild is packed with adventurers moving gear and getting ready for work, and as he watches them, he notices how weirdly quiet the room feels, wondering if someone put a silent spell on the area or something. A cheerful receptionist greets him with a big smile, welcoming him to the guild and asking what brings him in today. He tells her he's there to sign up as an adventurer, and she immediately grabs the registration book to get things started. The receptionist slides the paperwork across the desk and tells him it's all set, so she asks him to fill it out with his name and any skills or experience he's got. He just stands there for a second looking at the blank form, then he stops to think about what to write for his skills while looking down at the sword hanging by his side. After he finishes the form and hands it over, he can't help but feel a little bummed about the registration fee hitting his wallet. But the receptionist just smiles and says they've accepted his application before she starts explaining how the guild works, specifically how they handle the money for quests and the penalties you have to pay if you mess up a job. She goes on about how guild cards work and warns him that if he breaks the law or kills another member, he'll be banned from every guild in the country. And that's when she hands him a temporary tag and tells him he'll get the official card once he finishes his first training request. He takes the item from her. Looking at the basic beginner's tag he's been given, he's a bit underwhelmed seeing it's just a piece of wood with his name scratched onto it. He gives it one last look before hanging the wooden tag around his neck to make it official. The protagonist heads over to the massive request board, where a sign points him toward the rookie jobs located further inside. He stops for a second and realizes that the different colors on the board actually represent the various guild card ranks. And it turns out the guild assigns these ranks based on how strong a person is and what they've done, using materials as titles for everyone from stone-level rookies all the way up to legendary treasure-class heroes. Reaching the top ranks like Mithril requires a sign-off from the high-level executives, but those lucky few get special materials as a head start for their missions. He thinks about how amazing it would be to have gear made from that high-end stuff, but then he shakes it off. He's got to focus on making enough cash just to buy lunch today. Scanning the board for something he can actually handle, he looks for the specific quests tagged for beginners, until he sees a bunch of manual labor jobs like cleaning out city ditches, hauling trash at construction sites, and general maintenance around the capital. He pulls a flyer down, figuring it's fine since he did this kind of work for pocket money as a kid, and there's no penalty for rookies if things go wrong. After reading about how giant rats are eating the slimes that keep the sewers clean, he decides the situation is pretty bad and figures he might as well pick up one more job. He takes his choices back to the counter, where the receptionist confirms he's officially taking on 2 quests to collect slimes and herbs. The receptionist hands over the papers, making sure to mention that the stamp on the form is the only way to get paid, so he really shouldn't lose it. Heading out toward the city gates, he follows the signs while the sounds of the busy capital fade out behind him as he reaches the checkpoint where guards are busy checking everyone's customs forms and keeping the long line moving in order. When he gets to the front, he thanks the guard for the hard work and asks if he's clear to head through the gate, and the guard just smiles and lets him go, knowing that this area is basically just the Ferris family's backyard anyway. He keeps moving past the other travelers, keeping his eyes peeled for the stuff he needs to find out in the open fields, until something in the tall grass catches his eye, making him stop and drop down for a closer look at the ground. He finds exactly what he's looking for, the most basic type of medicinal herb out there, which is a solid start for his list. While he's busy gathering the plants, he notices a slime wobbling around nearby, just doing its own thing in the grass, and he remembers that these things mostly just eat trash and dead leaves, so they're pretty much harmless as long as you aren't tiny. He carefully picks up one of the slimes, though he looks pretty stressed out about holding the wobbly creature. It's totally clear, making him think about how it would probably turn a nasty sewage color if it lived in the drains. He starts packing them away, tucking the little guys right into his bag alongside all the herbs he gathered until he heads back to the guild, feeling a bit out of place as big armored adventurers walk past him. The place is absolutely packed when he gets inside, and he can't help but feel surprised by the massive crowd, so he stands in line, listening to guys complain about paperwork while others are already celebrating their successful runs. Groups are everywhere yelling cheers and slamming their drinks together to celebrate their wins, and there's even a rowdy arm wrestling match going on in the middle of the room that has everyone losing it. When he finally makes it to the front, he asks the receptionist if the guild is always this wild, and she just laughs and tells him that it definitely is, acting like the chaos is just another day at the office. The receptionist tells him the guild is always this rowdy, and some drunk guy nearby asks if he didn't enjoy the show, but she explains that getting used to the chaos is just part of the job for an adventurer. He looks down at the few coins in his hand and says he doesn't really mind the work, even though it's basically just chores for pocket money, like picking up slimes or helping out on a farm. Still, doing the small stuff like mopping floors every single day starts to add up to a little bit of savings, so he figures if he keeps his own food costs down, his younger siblings back home can eat more, even if it's barely anything. The next morning, the receptionist starts going over his new request while the regulars notice he's already back at it, and one of the big veteran guys gives him a pat on the shoulder, telling the newbie to do his best. The guy notices the new tag around his neck and mentions he finally got his official plate, which makes him realize that even though he can take real requests now, he's still just standing at the starting line. He stands there thinking about how fighting monsters means actually risking his life. It's a heavy thought, but he jumps right into the chaos at the guild board where everyone is shoving each other to grab a job. People always say that every adventurer has to face 3 big enemies during any quest they take on. The first is just other guys fighting for work in the morning, and the second is the actual monsters they go out to hunt. But the third enemy is usually their own greed making them spend their money, which is why most people never get ahead. He manages to push through the crowd and says he finally got a paper for himself, even though it was a struggle, and looking it over, he realizes he picked a dungeon monster hunt. It's a bit different because monsters inside dungeons aren't like the ones outside. When they die, their bodies just disappear into the ground. Instead of a corpse, they leave behind a magic stone, which is basically a crystal filled with mana, and while people used to be confused by how that worked, the Magic Institute finally figured out the secret behind it. People say a dungeon is actually a type of magic that creates shadows of monsters. It's basically a special spot packed with magical energy, a huge pool of mana where these dungeons form, and by using the magic stone as a core, a monster's shadow is born. It's a weird process where a shadow is just a copy of the original monster. The protagonist remembers something important about them. He learned from his oldest brother Albiro that these things don't have any individual differences. Their strength is always the same, making them predictable. But dungeons are spread out all over the Ilva continent, and word is there's massive treasure buried deep inside. Because of that, the researchers over at the Royal Magic Academy really focused on the fact that these monsters and their magic stone cores could be created. It turned into a huge business, because magic stones get turned into useful tools like lamps or food storage. They're so convenient that every rich noble and big merchant considers them a total necessity for their mansion. There's a catch, though. When the master of the labyrinth, the one guarding the treasure at the bottom, gets taken out, the magic stones stop being produced. That created a problem until the nation's magic stone supply started tanking every time a dungeon was conquered. The Mage Institute eventually fixed it by finding a way to artificially bring the labyrinths back to life. Even with all that magic, they still couldn't find a way to clear the monsters out of the labyrinths for good. Dungeon hunting is basically just like mining. You go in, wreck monsters, and grab their magic stones. It's a grind, and the guild receptionist can't believe her ears when she hears the protagonist wants to hit a labyrinth. She's looking at his basic outfit and points out that his gear is way too light for something that dangerous. She starts waving her hands around, totally stressed, telling him he should wait and save up for a full set of armor first, but the guy just brushes it off, saying it's no big deal and he'll be fine. The receptionist doesn't drop it, warning him that even a simple quest for a stone tablet can turn deadly if things go south. She reminds him that he's just a rookie and really needs to bring at least some decent equipment along. He just looks at her with total confidence and tells her not to worry because he's actually got a plan. Later, at the dark entrance of the dungeon, a goblin shows up and starts screaming its head off, but the protagonist moves in fast, dropping the monster with one clean strike right as he enters. The blonde protagonist keeps moving through the dungeon, splitting another goblin right down the middle with one heavy swing, and he finally takes a second to breathe, letting out a sigh while the magic stones from the monsters roll across the floor. He looks at the loot and realizes there were dozens of them, thinking about how they really managed to take down a ton of enemies. So he starts gathering everything up, kneeling on the cold floor to pack his bag full of stones as he clears the area. Suddenly, another goblin drops from the ceiling, screaming and trying to catch him off guard with a surprise jump. But the guy is way too fast. He stays locked in and catches the monster with a brutal strike right to the face before it can land. The impact sends the goblin flying backward, and the protagonist doesn't even break a sweat as he finishes the fight. He puts his weapon away and tells himself it's time to head out, looking at the last few stones glowing on the ground. Later, he makes his way over to the purchasing office right by the labyrinth where a guy is just sitting at the desk. The protagonist walks up and tells the clerk he wants to sell some stuff, dropping a massive bag that's stuffed completely full of stones. The clerk looks over the loot and says it's a crazy amount of magic stones, especially for a low-rank guy, and as he's doing the paperwork, he stops to stare at the protagonist's gear, commenting on the armor because it's way too nice for a rookie. He tells him he's got some high-quality stuff, and the protagonist just nods. Turns out the gear actually belongs to Albiro, the guy who's supposed to take over the Ferris family, so the protagonist is just renting it under a formal contract while his brother is away on a break. Even though he's making money, once he pays the rental fee and buys food, there's almost nothing left. But he knows that's just how it goes for now, looking at the tiny pile of coins compared to his expenses. And thinking about how gear gets trashed and fixed for a lot of money, he realizes his brother really took a risk. It was a huge favor for a big brother to look out for his younger sibling starting out as an adventurer. The protagonist stands there for a second, thinking about how he really owes his brother for the help. Just as a side note to everything that's been happening lately, it turns out that Albiro Nord was actually the one who taught him that specific strategy. While hanging out at the stables, Albiro thinks to himself that he hopes Node is doing his best right now. For a guy who graduated from the military academy, this whole plan was actually a pretty common way for knight apprentices to make some side money, since the weak monsters on the top floors can't really get through heavy armor. He's totally sure that Node is going to be fine and come back safe. So fast forward to 2 weeks after Node got promoted to plate rank, he's still out there grinding away and noticing that they've been taking down monsters at a really solid pace. He checks his latest loot, feeling a little worn out from the non-stop work, but he knows it's not slowing him down yet. He realizes his brother's vacation is over today, which means he's gotta have that armor back by tonight. Node thinks about how even if these monsters aren't a huge threat, they're still tough for a new plate rank, knowing that once he loses that armor, his efficiency is gonna tank. So he decides to pick up the pace while he still has the advantage. He starts tearing through the cave, cutting down every goblin in his path, moving fast and landing clean hits before any of them can even react to him. After the fight, Node looks at the loot in his hand and thinks about how far he's come, remembering how back at the start, he couldn't even handle an ambush and his body would just freeze up. His swings used to be totally off because he couldn't judge the distance right, and even when he did land a hit, it wasn't strong enough to actually do anything. But things are different now because he's finally gotten used to the weight of the armor. Node realizes he can actually read the monster's movements now, knowing exactly how to keep his distance and take on a whole group at once. Node takes a breather in the middle of the cave, sitting there thinking about how things are changing, and he jumps back into the action, landing a huge hit that does way more damage than before. Node notices his body feels light and his eyes can see through the dark perfectly. He can feel his strength totally spiking. He looks back on how he used to struggle with monster patterns, always wondering how they moved or what he should even do, but it turns out that after enough fighting, there's always a moment where you just feel yourself get stronger, and that's exactly where he's at. Making some cash with his high-end armor was part of the plan, but the real point of all this was just getting more powerful. The truth is, these artificial dungeons don't actually pay that well compared to the natural ones, mostly because magic stones are used for everything, so they're always in demand and can be sold for a decent price. The catch is that in these fake dungeons, the government buys the stones at low prices to keep a monopoly, and trying to sell them anywhere else is a huge crime. So even though adventurers are doing all the work to find these stones, most of that money just goes straight to the royal family. The thing is, the Adventurers Guild doesn't get much out of these artificial dungeon jobs. They're popular because they're safe for anyone who can swing a sword, but there's a catch. These missions don't give you any of the contribution points you need to actually move up in rank. Most adventurers are obsessed with ranking up from newbie toward the crystal tier since higher ranks mean way better pay and exclusive perks. And hunting monsters out in the wild is usually the better move anyway. You get completion bonuses and can sell the loot for a lot more than what you get in a labyrinth. Node knew all of this, so it's weird that he still chose to take a low-paying dungeon request. It makes you wonder what he was thinking, but it turns out he wasn't just after the magic stones. His real priority was just getting used to actual combat without dying. This wasn't his first time picking up a blade either. In the Ferris family, every son gets drilled in swordsmanship from the time they're little kids. Node actually had a real gift for it. Between his dad, his two older brothers, and the family guards, he had plenty of teachers and his skills shot up fast. Even though he never went to a military academy, people said he was already as good as a regular soldier, maybe even better. But the veterans who had seen real blood and war always had something to say. They made sure to keep him cautious and Node remembers being told that being good with a sword is one thing, but being good at war is totally different. Training drills can only take you so far, and true skill only shows up once you've actually been in a real fight. Node listens as the warning continues, hearing that if he ever forgets that, he might take down one guy but he'll be the next one to get dropped. Walking through the city, Node realizes his plan worked out. He got some real combat experience, didn't get hurt, and actually saved some cash, so with this he heads straight for the Blacksmith's Guild where the sign hangs over the door. As soon as he walks in, a big bearded guy behind the counter gives him a loud welcome and asks what he's looking for. Node hands over a note and says he needs a full set of armor plus a fresh edge on his sword, which makes the smith look twice. The guy asks if Node is an adventurer and what his rank is, so Node tells him he's been a plate for about 2 weeks now. The smith tells him to hang on a second while he goes to grab something from the back. He brings out a set of hard leather armor, explaining that it's been treated with a special agent to make it tough enough for real defense. The blacksmith mentions that even with the leather armor, a metal blade could still cut right through it. He asks if Node is some kind of trainee and why he isn't wearing chainmail. Node thinks to himself that this guy really pays close attention to what his customers need, and he considers the idea of getting chainmail for a second. He knows his father and brother are using the family sets, and there's no way he can afford a new one right now. He figures there's no point in bringing that up, so he just tells the smith he doesn't have any. The guy nods and shows him how the leather armor is designed to fit a protective plate inside the chest area, adding that sliding a wooden plate in there makes it much harder for a blade to pierce through. The smith explains that while chainmail is expensive, you really want the best protection you can get for your head and chest. Node asks if the armor can actually hold a plate strong enough to stop a real strike, but the smith reminds him it's still just wood. He explains that if the plate is too thick, it'll just crack and mess with his movement. He actually layered the leather specifically to keep any wood splinters from stabbing into Node's body if it breaks. The guy points out that an iron plate would be way better for defense and absorbing hits, but then he makes a gesture with his hand and says the real issue is the price. Moving on to the sword, Node says it's seen over 2 weeks of heavy use, and he really wants to get it polished up properly. The smith asks how much the total would be if they added one more item, but Node points out that adding the sharpening already maxes out his budget. He decides to just go for it and tells the guy to do it that way. Thinking that this isn't the kind of thing he should hesitate on, the smith tells him that for an adventurer, staying alive is the only thing that matters, so spending money to save your life is always the right move. Node agrees they have a deal, and the smith mentions the leather armor won't take long to adjust, but the sword needs a few days. He asks Node if he wants to pick them both up at the same time. The guy wonders for a second if Node would rather just gear up right there in the shop when the stuff is ready. A few days pass, and Node shows up to collect his gear, looking a lot more prepared with his sword and armor finally ready to go. Looking at his new setup, he realizes his next big goal has to be getting some real chainmail. It's made of metal rings and is pricey because it takes a lot of work. Node figures that defense should be his top priority no matter the cost, especially since he can keep using it even if he switches other gear later. He checks his notes and thinks about the meeting place for the quest. Node heads over to the plaza right in front of the castle gate. He spots the meeting spot for the quest and approaches a girl in a hat who's checking a map. She turns around and asks if he's another adventurer there for the gathering job, so she points him toward the registration area and tells him to show his guild card over there to get started. The carriage ride out is a total nightmare. It's way too crowded, and one guy tells Node to shift because his gear keeps bumping into him. Another guy complains about the brutal shaking while Node just tries not to get sick. Looking around, Node notices the other adventurers have really thin armor, but he tells himself not to judge their gear since it's mostly just a gathering quest, and the job itself is pretty straightforward. He accepted a request from the guild to go out and harvest medicinal herbs, but these aren't just common weeds. They're high-quality plants found about half a day's ride from the capital. And since they're used for making potions and currently in season, the Alchemy Guild put out a big request for them. The pay structure is a base reward plus a commission for what they find. It's a good rate because monsters actually show up at the site, which means it's not enough to buy that expensive chainmail in one trip. But after a few days of work, he'll still be coming home with a decent profit. Node has to follow the rules and bring his own supplies, so he's packed some preserved food, bags for the herbs, and basic camping gear like a lantern. Basically everything he needs to survive out there since the carriage ride is a long, bumpy mess that keeps him focused on the task ahead. The group finally pulls up to a massive open field near the mountains. And as they climb out, the guide holds up a sample and tells everyone to come grab one so they can get to work right after the explanation is finished. Node heads off into the trees on his own to start the search, and it isn't long before he notices some markings on the ground that catch his attention. He carefully peeks around a thick tree trunk to see if he's in the right spot, and there it is, the exact plant he was looking for sitting right in the brush. He kneels down, remembering how his training taught him that all the good medicinal stuff is concentrated in the leaves and the stems, so he makes a clean cut, knowing that harvesting it this way lets the herb grow back later before he moves on to find the next one. Node stands there thinking about how all those times gathering herbs near the capital really paid off. He figures he should probably write down where everything is, just in case he gets another job around here and starts getting back to work by the trees. He's focused on the plants, but then some small monster suddenly jumps out of the bushes right at him. By the time the sun starts dipping, he's got the first day's delivery all finished up. He tells himself it's probably a good idea to get a camp set up before it gets too dark, so he heads out to grab a big pile of firewood from the nearby brush. While he's out there, he spots some wild mushrooms and wishes he knew which ones were actually okay to eat. He knows that kind of survival info can be the difference between life and death, and realizes that if he could forage his own meals, he'd save a ton of money on food. He makes a mental note to buy a scout adventurer a drink once he's back in town just to pick their brain for some tips. Eventually, he makes his way down to the edge of the water to check things out. He decides to try his luck and puts together a simple fishing rod using a wooden stick and some string. The plan works out, so he starts gutting the fish he caught and slides them onto skewers to get them ready for the grill, but he still needs a light, so he heads over to another guy nearby and asks if he can borrow some fire. The guy is totally cool with it, so Node thanks him and gets ready to cook. The fish Node caught are finally sizzling away over the hot campfire. Smells great, and the other guy offers up some of his fire as a thank you. Node's a bit surprised and apologizes for the trouble, but he doesn't waste any time digging into his meal, taking a huge bite out of the fish. Sitting under the stars with the other adventurers, he thinks about how amazing everything tastes, way better than anything else as the first night of the gathering mission officially winds down. The other guy hands him a steaming hot bowl to go with his dinner, and Node thanks him while starting to eat. The guy mentions that even though it's a warm season, these nights still get pretty cold, but since the forest blocks the wind it isn't too bad. He adds that his dad told him the open plains would be way worse, so Node leans back, feeling totally relaxed and warm. He thinks to himself that this job is actually a pretty sweet deal. By day 3, Node sees the forest entrance has been picked clean of herbs, but there's still plenty more if he heads deeper in. Node looks over the area and realizes he doesn't even have to worry about finding enough herbs, they're everywhere. And he's making great progress until a strange noise coming from the deep brush stops him cold. He stares into the shadows, asking himself what that sound is, and as the noise gets louder, he starts to wonder if someone is nearby fighting, which doesn't make sense since the monsters around here are basically just wild animals. He thinks it's taking way too long, making him realize that whoever is out there must be really struggling. He knows he can't just sit back, so he says they need to go, even though he constantly reminds himself not to take dumb risks just to make money for his family back home. But even if he isn't training to be a knight anymore, he still can't stand the thought of leaving other adventurers to die. He takes off running, bursting through the trees until he finally sees them. A nasty pack of goblins has a group cornered in a clearing, but the adventurers are completely exhausted, barely hanging on and gasping for air as the monsters close in for the kill. Node doesn't hesitate. He drops right into the middle of the fight with his sword drawn, stepping in front of the group to take the goblins on himself. The black-haired guy can't believe his eyes and yells out that reinforcements are here. They're finally saved, and the red-haired girl asks if he's for real while she struggles to keep a goblin back with her dagger. But another guy in the group jumps in, yelling thanks as he lands a solid hit on one of the monsters. Seeing a chance to survive, the whole group pulls it together and gets back into a fighting stance. Node stays focused on the fight, noticing these goblins are actually way better at fighting than the ones he saw in the labyrinth. Even so, he doesn't let it rattle him, He knows that no matter how good they are, a goblin is still just a goblin, and he realizes his new gear is solid since it can block a wooden spear without any issue. The black-haired guy notices Node's kit too, mentioning how that armor looks like it'd be tough to move in with so little coverage. Node just gives a vague hum while the rest of the exhausted rookies collapse and try to catch their breath. He stands there watching them until someone finally calls out to him to get his attention. The guy Node just helped catches his breath and thanks him for the save, introducing himself as Genius before asking for Node's name. Node notices Genius is bleeding from his ear and reaches out, asking if he's doing alright since he looks pretty banged up. Genius just brushes it off, saying that thanks to Node, he only ended up with some minor cuts instead of something way worse, then tells Node to check something out. He introduces the girl in their group as Rises, the party's priest, who looks like she's completely wiped out from the fight. Genius admits they'd all be dead if it wasn't for her keeping them together, and Node just nods along, starting to see how much they've been through. The girl with the short hair and the bandage on her nose pipes up next, introducing herself as Shino and thanking Node for the assist, while the other girl in the group looks over at her friend Almana, clearly relieved that everyone actually made it out in one piece. Even the big guy in the back named Jagos gets a shout-out, with the group showing some major gratitude for him holding the line. Rises finally pulls herself together and introduces herself to Node, kindly asking if he's hurt and offering to heal him up with her magic. Node tells her thanks, but he's actually fine and didn't get hit once, so Genius yells for her to come help him over there instead. Rises looks like she's about to collapse, her face totally flushed and covered in sweat from the strain. Genius catches her as she stumbles, calling out her name while looking seriously worried about how she's holding up, but Rises just gives him a weak smile, saying she's alright and just pushed her magic a bit too far. Genius takes one look at her and tells the rest of the group they're done for today since Rises is spent, meaning the rest of the party doesn't argue at all, with the others admitting they've all reached their limit as well. The group starts packing up their gear at the campsite, all agreeing that it's finally time to head back home, and as they move through the camp, the other adventurers notice how beat up they look and start asking what happened. Node pulls Genius aside to ask exactly how many monsters they dealt with, and Genius tells him they hit a massive horde. And when Genius mentions there were about 50 goblins, Node can barely believe it, repeating the number out loud, before telling Genius how impressive it is that they survived a fight like that, though Genius just looks completely exhausted. Genius explains how he tried fighting back in the forest, but the sheer number of monsters was just too much. Shino adds that since they couldn't get away, they got stuck fighting in the plaza, and she's not even sure they would have made it if Node hadn't shown up, just as the group at the campsite notices them coming back, with one of them joking about speaking of the devil right as they arrive. Node offers up some food for the soup, telling Genius he needs to eat a good meal since he's probably lost a lot of blood, which makes Genius thank Shino as she gives a confident thumbs up and tells everyone to just leave the cooking to her. She mentions her family actually runs an inn, so she's going to treat everyone to a seriously delicious meal as a thank you. But first she checks with Genius to see if it's okay to use a ton of their supplies, and he tells her to go for it. Genius turns to Node and tells him he's in for a treat because Shino is actually a really skilled cook. Shino starts prepping the food, expertly slicing through meat, and getting a big pot of soup going until everything is ready, leaving the whole party to finally sit down and dig into the hot meal, looking completely refreshed as they eat together. Genius mentions that with so many goblins around, their nest is probably huge, and Almana thinks that even if there's no big treasure, they might have some loot stashed away, which makes Shino admit she was way too stressed earlier to even think about that, while Genius calls out to Node as he's busy writing in his notebook. Genius points out that tomorrow is their final day out here, and asks Node if he'd be down to go find the goblin nest with them. Node starts worrying because the chaos today kept him from finishing his work. He only got about 60% of the herbs he needs and isn't sure he should be taking a day off. Thinking about how hunting goblins isn't actually part of his paid contract, though the idea of finding actual coins in a nest starts to sound pretty good, since it's common knowledge that these creatures love to hoard random treasure and stolen goods in their dark little dens. Node stands up and tells the group he's made a choice, thinking to himself that a real adventure is worth more than anything, so he tells the party he's coming along and that it's good to finally meet them properly. Genius is pumped and throws an arm around Node, saying he's looking forward to it just as much, leaving the whole group excited for the morning, with Almana saying Node is worth 100 men and Jagos agreeing that an adventurer's job is to actually go on adventure. The plan is set for the morning, with Genius saying they should head out as soon as the sun is up. Node agrees, thinking they can just gather herbs if things go south, so the group heads out into the woods the next day, feeling pretty good about the hunt. As they walk, Node can't help but count his herbs, thinking about how every 10 of them is worth a copper coin, while Shino just tries to keep her head in the game. Everything's going fine until Almana suddenly holds up a hand and tells everyone to stop right where they are, making the whole group freeze in place. She tells them they need to wait a second and stay quiet. Genius looks over and asks if she's taking the first watch, but she's already spotted something in the brush. She spots a goblin scout up ahead and pulls back her bow string, lining up a clean shot while she lets the arrow fly. It hits the mark perfectly, dropping the creature before it can make a sound. With the coast clear, they move toward the entrance of the cave, staying low as they slip inside the dark tunnel. Node stops to check something near the entrance, and Almana turns back to ask if something happened or if he found something. Node opens up the container to check for loot, but he tells Almana it's mostly just food and supplies, so he looks pretty let down while staring at the box, asking if this small haul is really all they managed to find. He and Shino start stressing out, with Node saying this whole trip might be a bust since the herb payout won't be great either. Shino holds up a piece of fur she found, but admits it's so tattered and messy that they probably won't be able to sell it. Node just looks at her and says the other guys in the party aren't the type to care about that kind of small stuff. He calls out to everyone to get their heads in the game as they move deeper into the cave, and they finally reach a massive clearing where a whole pack of goblins is huddled together in the dark. Node stares ahead with a serious look on his face, quietly telling the group that they've finally found them. Genius takes charge and tells the group the plan is to have the front line charge in the second Almana fires her first shot. He tells Jagos to go on the attack while Rises stays back to heal anyone who gets hurt, and everyone gets ready. Node gives the signal for everyone to move out. The goblins start losing it, screaming as the group slams into their lines. Node leads the way with a huge shout and the goblins look completely terrified. One of them takes a massive hit to the face as Genius jumps into the mix. He's throwing heavy strikes, sending goblins flying back. And while Jagos uses his raw strength to crush anything in his path, Almana and Rises keep a close eye on the front line from a safe distance. The fight ends pretty fast, leaving the guys standing over a pile of defeated monsters. Almana looks happy the threat is gone, but then she runs over to Node to ask if they found any gold or treasure in the chest. Node looks pretty let down. He tells her they didn't find much of anything, which gets Shino all worked up, asking if there's any money at all. Node says maybe, while Genius helps him tip the whole thing over so they can finally see what they're dealing with. Shino is pretty hyped as everything spills out, and Genius pulls out a sword to check the quality, but Node takes a closer look at the pile and realizes it's mostly just a bunch of copper coins. Almana circles back to see if they missed anything hidden inside, while Jagos just stands there exhausted, not saying a single word. Someone shouts out that they found a silver coin. They're totally hyped about the find because back at the camp, someone asks how the whole trip went. The guys admit there wasn't much worth taking, which makes sense since they were only dealing with goblins, and the main goal was just to grab some herbs anyway. Rises says she's just glad everyone is safe, and Genius agrees while they grab some food, but Genius starts complaining about the long wagon ride waiting for them in the morning. Jagos just tells him it is what it is. Node stays quiet, just watching his new friends relax around the fire after the long day. He looks at his share of the loot. Once everything was split up, it really wasn't much better than herb gathering, but he doesn't seem to mind. He smiles to himself, thinking that even without a big payday, meeting this crew made the whole thing worth it. The group finishes up their meal, ready for whatever comes next, and far away from the woods, the sun shines down over the massive buildings of the royal capital. Node heads over to the guild notice board to check out the latest jobs. Genius finds him there, and they chat for a bit before Node takes his paperwork to the front counter to finish up. The lady behind the desk suddenly yells out a huge congratulations, and she tells him that he's finally earned enough points for a promotion. He's officially eligible to move up to the second rank, so the receptionist asks if he's ready to accept the special promotion quest right now. Node takes a second to think because hitting gemstone class is a pretty big deal. It means he can finally start taking on escort jobs which pay way better than just hunting small stuff. These missions usually mean guarding caravans or big-shot travelers, but they always have strict rules, and if a route is known for being dangerous, clients will specifically ask for high-rank fighters who have already dealt with those monsters. The guild doesn't take risks either. They won't let anyone below gemstone class even touch a bodyguard contract, no matter how easy it looks. At the end of the day, it's all about strength. That's the only thing that really matters for an adventurer looking to climb the ladder, so the guild makes them prove it with a special test. If they can knock out a quest that's a whole rank above them, they get the promotion. The guild's manual lays it all out. Clients bring their problems to the desk, and the guild turns those into jobs for adventurers. While the pay for these social missions isn't always great, they give out a ton of contribution points, which is exactly why they're used for rank-up tests. Node asks the receptionist what kind of promotion jobs they have available for him right now. She looks a bit surprised by his energy, but immediately starts digging through the official logs to find a match. and she flips through the pages until she finds the right entry. She tells him that this is the only promotion request currently approved for someone at his level, so she hands over a sheet with a sketch of a mean-looking wolf with a massive scar over its eye. The job is a subjugation quest, and the target is a beast known as the rock wolf. These things live in the eastern mountains and act like normal wolves, but they're covered in natural armor. The young ones have a few plates, but the alpha of the pack is almost totally encased in a hard shell. Node starts thinking back to all the intel he's gathered while hanging out at the local taverns with high-rank adventurers. He spent a lot of time listening to veterans brag over drinks, and he's realized those guys weren't just talking for no reason. They gave him the lowdown on how these wolves hide in the mountains and warned him that their armor is so tough that most attacks just bounce right off. Node's been keeping a massive notebook full of all this stuff. It's got everything from monster weaknesses and maps to herb tips and random food recipes he's picked up. Looking at the quest sheet alongside his own notes, Node finally gets why the guild picked this monster for the test. It's definitely not going to be an easy win, but he knows what he's getting into. Unlike goblins that just rush you in a big mess, wolves actually work together and coordinate their strikes, which makes fighting them a whole different game. Node gets a real taste of their power when a rock wolf slams into his shield. He finally understands exactly what he's up against, and it's pretty wild because their armor is actually made of fur. The tips of the hair get all tangled and start to harden up over time, and as they get older, that gray coat just keeps getting thicker. Eventually, it turns into something that feels more like solid stone than fur. So by the time a wolf is fully grown, its hide is basically bulletproof. Most normal swords won't even leave a scratch on them, which means this isn't going to be like his old hunts. Back then, he could just toughen up his own gear and take out things like goblins or boars without breaking a sweat, but this time he's facing an enemy that's actually on his level. It's a totally different game when you're dealing with stone-hard armor instead of thin plates, and Node checks his notes, reminding himself that these things don't just have armor, they also hunt in teams. He's pretty sure he can win, but he knows he can't afford to be reckless. One wrong move and he'll be pushed way past his limit, especially since he's been doing the math on his current skills and gear. Based on how he handled those goblins, he figures he could probably fight off 10 wolves at once. But that's the problem, packs usually start at 10 and can go up to 100. The latest reports say there's a massive group of them out there right now. The reports show a massive pack of rock wolves gathered on the cliffs. Node realizes that with 30 of them, getting surrounded means certain death. So the guild receptionist asks if there are any other adventurers around his level he could team up with. Node just stares at the paper, knowing the situation is pretty rough. She explains that a bunch of the local parties all got promoted to stone rank at the same time, meaning all the easy promotion requests are already gone. Node sighs, realizing this dangerous wolf hunt is the only thing left on the board, and it doesn't help that Genius isn't around to back him up. He thinks about how their coordination was actually getting good lately, but the other guys he knows are busy too. The adventurer Node saved says he's heading out on a long gathering trip to get better armor, leaving the receptionist waiting for an answer. She asks him what he's going to do while he looks over his notes one last time. He wonders if he's actually as good as the rest of the group. He tells himself it's better to just wait for the others to get back so they can work together, and decides to pass on the wolf quest. He tells her to just give him a job he can actually handle on his own for now. Fast forward to 3 days later, Node is sitting at a table with his head in his hands, looking completely crushed by how things are going. Node is sitting there with his head in his hand, looking completely drained. He wonders if they really have to go hunt those rock wolves right this second, but a voice from behind asks if they're running low on money. Node just stands there facing away, and he asks Alec what he means by that. Alec leans over his desk looking pretty worried while checking the records. He starts to explain the situation again, even though he knows Node is already aware. He tells him straight up that the Ferris family's money situation is looking pretty bad, and mentions the biggest issue is that they're spending way more than they're bringing in. Alec brings up how Node has had several younger siblings born in just the last few years. They're still little, so their food doesn't cost that much yet. But even with 6 kids under the age of 6, the regular daily needs start to pile up until the bill is huge. Node just rubs his chin, admitting that Alec is probably right about that. Alec adds that Lilia is already 13, so they have to start thinking about the tuition for the Noble Academy where their mother and sister studied, which suddenly makes everything click for Node as he realizes the pressure. He looks down at his hand and admits that if he goes off to the military academy, their household finances aren't going to survive. Node gives Alec a kind smile and tells him it's all right, but Alec just looks back at him, clearly feeling the weight of the situation. Right now, they're only staying afloat because of the wages coming in from Albiro and the extra money Johan sends back after marrying into another family. On top of that, they've even got Hannah out there working as a maid in a different house just to help the family out. which Alec points out is the only reason they're barely hanging on, especially with everything Node brings in. But there's still a huge problem. He drops the bomb that they absolutely need to come up with a massive amount of cash by the middle of next month, leaving Node standing there with his head in his hand as he realizes that's when the debt deadline hits. Alec looks at the empty coin pouch and says he's sorry. He's literally done everything he possibly could to make the numbers work. Up until this point, the Ferris family has been surviving by taking out loans whenever they ran out of cash. And while it's pretty normal for noble families to be in debt, most of them have actual land and can just pay it back once the harvest is over. The problem is the Ferris family doesn't have any land. They just have their pension and the old house, which doesn't actually bring in any real wealth. Aside from a few relatives, the only person who ever lent them money without caring about being paid back was a friend of Albert's. And Node looks at his hands that debt is still hanging over them. The situation is desperate because they've already pawned off every single thing in the house multiple times. So that's not an option anymore, leaving nothing left in their home except for the family swords and armor. But getting rid of those isn't an option either, since losing their gear would mean the end of the Ferris family as a line of warriors, which is a huge deal, because the kings of succession always look to their direct military force whenever things get bad. In their world, your status is based on how close you live to the capital, so it's actually a massive honor that the Ferris family lives in such a nice district. They're situated closer to the royal castle than even the highest-ranking ministers or counts, because they are a warrior house with a history of serving the crown. Node knows that if they ever gave up their weapons, they wouldn't be able to fight when the time came, and the family would just be abolished. Sure, there are other ways to get the cash, but borrowing from loan sharks or shady nobles is a trap that only leads to a tragic end. Johan knows he can't just go asking for help whenever he wants, especially since he's technically just a son-in-law in his new family now. He's worried that if they see him as a lord who can't even manage basic finances, they'll just treat him like a figurehead or even worse, cut him off and end the marriage, which would leave him stuck with shady choices like skipping out on wages or taking bribes, basically dragging the family name through the dirt. Looking at his tag, Node realizes that even though adventurers literally put their lives on the line, the pay is good enough that even a beginner could buy a full set of gear pretty fast. Thinking it over, Node turns to Alec and asks for the exact number they need to come up with. So Alec reaches into his desk and pulls out the ledgers, showing him the document where all the specific amounts are written down. Node looks at the total and actually smiles a bit, saying he can probably pull that off if he really grinds for it, so he promises he'll find a way. Alec just looks exhausted. He wipes the sweat off his forehead as he deals with the stress. It's been like this for a long time, with Alec managing the chaos since Node was just a kid playing with wooden swords while everyone else was losing their cool. Node takes a second to really think about it and realizes he's been putting a massive burden on Alec and the rest of the staff this whole time. Node hunches over with his head in his hands, realizing that if even Alex is coming to him for money, the family must be in a really bad spot. The weight of it all hits him hard, and he knows that staying at his current rank will take way too long to earn the cash they need, so he tries to psych himself up, thinking that if he can just take down the Rock Wolf and get promoted to stone rank, he can grind through enough jobs to make it in time. But the motivation doesn't last long. He faceplants onto the bar table, totally drained and admitting to himself that his plan was probably a pipe dream. He just sits there at the counter looking like a mess, while someone in white leg armor starts walking right up behind him. The person calls out to him, and Node slowly looks over his shoulder with a confused expression on his face, only to see Shino standing there. She's got a confident smile on her face as she looks down at him from the side of his stool. She leans in close, asking him what he's been groaning about for so long, and then offers to give him a helping hand. Shino asks again what's been on his mind, noticing he's been mumbling to himself for quite a while now, so she just stands there looking cool in her gear, waiting to hear what kind of trouble Node has got himself into this time. Shino looks over with a surprised expression while Node just sits there looking confused, wondering why she's hovering. And then the bartender speaks up from behind the counter, explaining that since everyone else is out on jobs, Node is the only guy left around. Shino tells him that his constant mumbling was way too loud to ignore, making Node realize he was being pretty obvious about his stress. She orders the same drink Node is having and waits, so he finally apologizes and admits he's been dealing with some heavy stuff, and Shino leans in way too close, getting right in his space while she asks him to just say what's actually bothering him. She thinks a little chat would be a good change of pace, so Node tells her the truth. He needs a lot of money by next month. He explains that he needs to hit gemstone rank as fast as possible, but the only job that can get him there is hunting down a rock wolf. Node points out that he's actually the only adventurer at his rank who can even take the job, which definitely gets Shino's attention. He admits that he can't find a party and the monster is way too tough to handle alone, so he's been stuck trying to figure out a plan. Shino looks over the request paper and nods, agreeing that Node has definitely found himself in a really tough spot. Elsa leans in with a lot of energy, asking what this rock wolf is actually like, and if there's even a plan, but Node just looks pretty stressed, muttering about how the information he got definitely didn't come cheap. Elsa shrugs it off, saying she's open to a good idea, so Node shows her the documents and asks for her take. The two of them spend a quiet second looking over the papers, trying to make sense of the details, and Elsa finally admits that taking this thing down solo is basically impossible, which Node knows all too well. She goes quiet for a second, looking him right in the eye before suddenly asking what his name is. Node gets a bit flustered, realizing he's been talking this whole time without even introducing himself. So he gives her a big smile and tells her he's Node Ferris, saying it's officially nice to meet her. She smiles back and says her name is Elsa Chronicle. And then she starts to say something else. They shake hands, making their new partnership official. Elsa looks Node right in the eye and asks if he wants to form a gang with her, catching him completely off guard. She explains that she's a stoneplate rank just like him, and she only needs a few more quests to qualify for a promotion. She argues that teaming up would let them finish those jobs way faster so they can hunt the rock wolf together, and Node has to admit she's right. He starts thinking about how dangerous it is to be out there alone, especially since the biggest risk of solo fighting is getting blindsided from behind. It's a constant worry because human vision is stuck at 180 degrees no matter how much training you do. He knows that trying to listen for enemies in his blind spots is okay for a backup, but it's never enough to stay totally safe. In a real fight where one mistake is fatal, you have to rely on your eyes to read every tiny muscle movement. But if he's always anxious about a back attack, his focus breaks and his accuracy just starts to drop. Using the environment to keep from getting flanked only works for so long, and he's finally starting to feel the pressure. Elsa points out that teaming up changes everything because they can cover for each other and keep the pressure on with more attacks, which is way better than being alone. Even if one of them gets poisoned, put to sleep, or is just about to go down, the other can step in and save them as long as they're still standing. Node looks her in the eye and asks if he can really count on her to have his back, and Elsa just gives him a confident smile. She says that's perfect and seems pretty pumped that he's actually agreeing to the plan. She leads him over to the quest board, saying that getting some real practice in is the only way to actually learn how they both fight. She scans the papers and picks one out, asking what he thinks about taking on a giant frog hunt. Node looks at the Slate class request and thinks it's a solid choice for their first time out. These things are massive toads that show up all over the place. They grow as big as an ox and breed like crazy during the spring, and since they eat pretty much anything, they end up being a huge threat to anyone living nearby. They don't just ruin crops, they'll swallow livestock whole and even target kids in villages that don't have walls, so everyone is always looking for adventurers to deal with them. The great frog is a total pain because its tongue lashes out like a whip, and its slimy skin makes it really hard to land a solid hit. Node remembers his first time fighting one, and how much he and his old crew struggled to take it down. He checks with Elsa to make sure they've found the right village, and she confirms there's a massive outbreak at the local spring. Node feels for the villagers since having these things in the water is a nightmare. Just then, a giant frog shows up and lets out a massive croak, followed by more of them popping up along the riverbank and in the water. They're everywhere, and the whole area starts getting loud as the group of monsters begins to gather. Node takes a look and counts over 20 of them lurking in the brush. Elsa stops him for a second to make a proposal. Node asks what's up, and she tells him she wants to be the one to head in and fight first. Since the team-up was her idea, she really wants to prove her worth by showing him exactly what she's capable of. Node asks Elsa if she's ever actually gone up against a giant frog before, but she just brushes it off, telling him she'll be totally fine because she's way stronger than she looks. She steps up and immediately starts tearing through them, leaving Node completely floored by how good she is. He can barely keep track of her as she zips around, cutting down every frog in sight with zero effort. Node watches her move and realizes her aggressive style is the total opposite of his defensive focus. She's like a literal fire burning through the battlefield. Before he can even help, Elsa stands over the last one and apologizes for taking them all out by herself. She turns back to him with a grin, asking if he's convinced of her strength yet. With the area cleared out, the two of them pack up and start making their way back through the forest. A few days later, they head out again to hunt some forest wolves. Node figured it would be a good way to get some practice in, but Elsa jokes that these things aren't even worth calling enemies since they're so easy. Node just gives a quick nod as things become official. The Node and Elsa party is finally a real thing. They make the long trip out to the eastern mountains of the kingdom. Pulling their small gear cart along, Node looks up at the massive, dry cliffs and wonders how any creature could actually survive out here. Elsa explains that the monsters use these heights as a home base and only head down to the plains when they're hungry. She mentions that staying in such a rough spot is actually a smart way for them to avoid being hunted by even bigger predators, though Node remembers that's just something some drunk guy told him once. He lets out a grunt as he tosses the last heavy bag onto the pile, asking Elsa if that's the last of it. The tiny handcart rattles and groans under the weight of all their supplies, looking like it might just snap. Node sighs, wishing they had the money to rent a proper carriage, but he knows they're too broke for that. Elsa doesn't seem to care about the budget though, slamming her spear down and asking if they're ready to do this. There are basically two main things that make a rock wolf different from the forest wolves Node is used to. For starters, their fur has basically turned into a hard shell, giving them way more defense than any normal wolf. The second big difference is how they hunt. Since their mountain home is safe but has almost zero food, they have to travel all the way down the cliffs just to eat, which makes them less efficient than other monsters. To fix that, they started splitting up into small squads and using a spread-out hunting style to find prey, meaning their groups are usually smaller than forest wolves, sticking to just 5 or 10 members. But since they're armored up, their success rate is actually higher, making the guild treat them as a real threat. Node calls out to Elsa as the first one lunges, staying focused on the pack's movement as things get loud. The real problem is their strategy. The squad leaders stay back and howl to bring in a bunch of backup, so Elsa charges straight for the snarling leader, asking if that's the one they need to take out first. Node moves in fast, driving his spear right through the rock wolf's defenses and ending it, scanning the area to confirm no more wolves are coming, while Elsa asks if they're ready to start carving. Node pulls out his knife and gets to work, carefully slicing through the thick hide and stone plates until he finally finishes peeling off the massive pelt and takes a quick breather, seeing Elsa is already way ahead. He looks over at her while she works and thinks about how she's actually way faster at this than him, staying on guard, as he realizes the fight was so easy he didn't even need the tear gas he brought along. Elsa keeps counting her kills, and Node can't help but notice that even though they're the same age, her skills are just on another level. He knows he couldn't hit those tiny armor gaps, yet she hit every vital spot perfectly. Node just gives a little laugh, finally seeing the massive difference in natural talent between the two of them, finishing up the job while thinking about how lucky he actually is to be paired up with someone that good. The next morning rolls around and Elsa is already feeling the weight of the trip, mentioning that if the hunt stays this easy, they probably brought way too much gear. Node just laughs it off and agrees that she's probably right about them overpacking. But he notices there are way more wolves around than he first thought, though Elsa's clean kills mean the pelts are still in perfect condition. Since these rock wolf hides are high-quality materials for making armor, they're worth a ton of money, which makes Node realize they'll have more than enough cash to pay Alec back without any trouble. The two of them load up their massive packs and keep moving, scouting out the rocky hills as they hunt for the next pack. By the night of the fourth day, Node is back at camp counting the haul, noting they've already taken down 25 wolves, which proves his hunch was right about the guild's request form undercounting how many monsters were actually out here. Elsa mentions they didn't even run into a single fight all day, so she figures they'll be totally wrapped up with the job in just a few more days. But on the fifth day, things take a turn. The mountain fills with the sound of howling as a massive pack finally corners them. Node grinds his teeth as the situation turns south, cursing under his breath while trying to keep his footing against the wave of wolves closing in. Elsa shouts that the spot they're in is a total disaster and they're about to be completely surrounded, so Node realizes he totally fell for a trap. He blames himself for letting his guard down just because the hunt seemed too easy, but looking back, there was always a chance things would go sideways like this. It's happened plenty of times before where the actual number of monsters is way higher than what the guild reports say, and Node definitely should have remembered those warnings from the veteran adventurers he met back at the guild. He snaps out of it and locks in, telling Elsa it's time to use that one specific move they talked about, while he grabs his gear and shouts over the growling to ask her if she's ready to run for it. Elsa looks focused and tells him she's good to go, bracing herself as the wolves lunge at them from every side. Node gives the signal and they both take off like a shot, sprinting right through the middle of the pack to find an opening. Elsa screams out for Node as a wolf lunges and bites into him, and Node just grunts through the pain, apologizing for the slip-up while the two of them stay back to back. But things are finally starting to get even more dangerous as Elsa's eyes go wide with fear. She yells for Node to look out, and he turns around completely caught off guard by what's coming. A massive shadow falls over them, and Elsa says this is officially the worst situation possible, which Node totally agrees with. An armored wolf shows up, towering over the regular pack with thick plates covering its body like a suit of iron. Node stares up at the giant beast and starts telling Elsa everything he knows about these monsters, because it's a high-ranking specimen that only gets tougher as it gets older. Their skin turns as hard as metal, which is why everyone calls them armored wolves. Node remembers writing in his notes about how rare they are, even joking that hunting them would be a great way to spend time with a pretty girl. The books say these things are only for top-rank adventurers, and that old guy at the guild told him not to worry because sightings are so rare. Node watches the beast stand over them and curses that old drunk for being so wrong. Node stands over the fallen pack and sighs to himself, muttering about how this is just his luck as he looks down from the cliffs at even more of them gathering below, honestly wondering how things got this bad. One of the wolves lunges at him with a snarl, forcing Node to reach for a backup plan he really didn't want to use. The entire area goes up in a massive explosion, with fire and smoke tearing through the pack. Like Elsa looks at the charred mess and complains that it's a total waste, since those pelts usually sell for a lot. The remaining wolves catch fire and try to run, but the damage is already done, leaving Node standing in the smoke, while the reality sets in burning them was the only way through that armor, even if it ruined the loot. That's the thing about being a high-rank adventurer. It's all about picking the right tactics and knowing when to avoid a direct fight. Promotion quests use these wolves as a test because they're easy to handle if you're actually prepared, and Elsa looks down at Node, telling him to just forget about the burnt fur since his life is worth way more than some ruined pelts anyway. Elsa asks Node if he was actually confident he could win while they were surrounded, since she definitely wasn't, and he just gives a nervous yes. Node admits he only bought that expensive oil to make sure he'd make it home alive, but seeing the price tag makes him lose it, though Elsa just says desperate times call for desperate measures. It turns out that oil burns incredibly well because those wolves have armor that's basically caked in natural grease. So Node tries to look on the bright side, thinking the promotion and making a friend like Elsa makes the cost worth it. Everything gets quiet for a second as Elsa calls out his name, both of them standing there while Node looks ahead with total focus, telling her he already knows what's coming next. Right as the flaming wolves start snarling and snapping their jaws, looking way more aggressive than before. The whole pack charges at once, so Node says it's time to move and Elsa tells him she's right behind him. Node catches the first one midair, slashing right through the monster as it lunges, but even with Elsa stabbing another one, the pack is moving way too fast, and one of them catches Node off guard and knocks him back. Node's teeth are gritted in pure pain, the monster's grip is like a vice, and he's barely holding on while Elsa screams out to ask if he's okay. But there's no time to answer as the wolf keeps up its crazy attack, and Node realizes that even though his chainmail stopped the blade, the beast can still grab onto him, leaving him frozen as the massive wolf lets out a roar that shakes the whole forest, both of them just staring as the flaming monster leaps through the air right at Node's head. He hits the dirt and barely gets his shield up to stop the beast from tearing his throat out. Node screams as he tries to push the snarling face away. The thing's teeth are just inches from his eyes, and suddenly Elsa flies in with a massive swing, catching the wolf right in the side of the head and sending it back, but she quickly warns Node that it's not over yet. Node catches his breath, telling her she really saved him there. They both watch the monster stand back up. Elsa says they landed a deep hit, but the thing is just too tough to stay down. Node looks at the beaten beast and says it's almost finished, so they should just end this right now. He charges in with his shield, yelling that he won't let the thing pull the same move on him again. The monster stands there, legs shaking and barely able to keep its balance. Elsa doesn't give it a second to recover, lunging forward with her weapon to finish it off for good. The wolf finally goes down, leaving Node and Elsa exhausted on the ground. Later on, Node starts digging into the dirt, saying he's going to bury the bodies so they don't rot. Elsa is totally floored by the count, saying she can't believe Node actually took down 8 of those things. But Node is already thinking about the money, hoping the guild gives them a bonus. She's still annoyed though, saying the guild messed up the count and she's going to complain. Then she notices Node is busy with something else and asks what he's up to. Node looks back with a hammer in his hand, explaining that he's mining for ore since they spent so much cash getting ready for this trip. He holds up a shiny piece of rock, saying they need to grab whatever they can to cover their costs before the guild carriage shows up to take them home. Node spots something in the dirt and yells out, making Elsa realize he actually found what he wanted. She asks if that's a medicinal herb he's found, but Node just sighs like he's totally over it. Later on, the carriage ride turns out to be a total nightmare. Elsa complains about how tight the space is on the way home, while Node just sits there looking completely wiped out. Node tries to look on the bright side since they have their loot, but Elsa is barely hanging on in the back of the wagon. 4 days later, Elsa storms into the Adventurers Guild looking absolutely furious. The receptionist starts shaking as Elsa demands to know why they were sent to fight way more monsters than the report said. She keeps going, saying it was basically a death sentence to put their rank up against a monster that strong, and the poor receptionist can only bow and apologize while Node and his old crew stay far away from the explosion. Everything works out though, as Elsa shows off a huge bag of gold she managed to shake out of the guild as a bonus. Node tells Elsa that her outburst at the guild was exactly what he expected. She just replies that he was actually the scary one back there. Node starts counting their earnings, mentioning that once they add the rock wolf pelts, they're making a solid profit even after paying for the traps. So Elsa listens while looking a bit embarrassed, but Node isn't done talking yet since the two of them just got promoted to cobblestone rank adventurers, sitting there with all their gold and the official notice. As they look over their new rank tags, Elsa speaks up to get his attention. Node looks over and asks what's on her mind. She asks if he'd be willing to sell her his share of the armored wolf parts, reminding him that they're supposed to split the loot and the reward 50-50. She explains that the wolf materials are the last thing to settle. Since a lot of the materials burned in the fight, there's only enough left for one set of armor. Elsa keeps making her case, saying that having gear made from those specific parts would make their future jobs way easier, and she points out that Node needs the money while she wants the equipment. She asks him if their interests don't just line up perfectly. Node is totally down for the deal and says it'd be a pleasure. The two of them clink their mugs together to celebrate the new partnership. Node makes it back to the estate and calls out for Alec. He's finally back from his latest job. Alec shows up right away, giving him a formal welcome home as Node hands over a heavy bag of gold. He tells Alec the agreed amount is in there, but tells him to double-check everything just to be safe. Alec says he's got it, following behind as they walk through the hall. Node waves him off, saying he's completely wiped and is going to go get some sleep, leaving Alec standing there holding the bag. He looks down at the money and just whispers Node's name, clearly feeling a lot of weight on his shoulders. It's been 2 months since that crazy fight with the rock wolf, and life is basically back to normal. Node is slumped over on a stool looking exhausted after their latest hunt. Elsa looks at him and asks if that was a bit much just for some leather armor, and Node doesn't even try to argue. He admits that he was actually starting to feel like his current gear wasn't enough anyway. He looks pretty serious about it, telling her she's right, it's definitely time for him to get an upgrade. Elsa takes a bite of her meal while Node stares at her new setup, thinking that having armor wolf gear must be pretty nice. It's apparently as strong as metal but way lighter, making him admit he's actually been wanting a set just like it. Elsa stands up to show off the new look with a proud pose, while Node just watches her, looking completely wiped out. She sets her drink back down on the table and asks what his actual plan is, suggesting he should probably get his gear sorted out soon if he wants to be ready for his next promotion request. Node leans on the table and says he needs to save cash and avoid the shops, so Elsa tells him that supplying the materials himself is the best move. There are pretty much only 2 ways for an adventurer to get their hands on new gear. You either buy something ready-made right off the shelf, or you go for a full custom order. Custom stuff is usually way more expensive, but if you bring the materials yourself, you can get it made for free and save a ton of money. Node looks over and asks if that's how she got her armor made, using the materials they brought in together. Elsa checks in on the progress and asks how the work is going, while the blacksmith tells her he's got it handled, explaining that since the material is similar to rock wolf armor, it didn't even cost that much extra to put together. Later at the bar, Node mentions he wants to make scale armor, but Elsa is confused because she thinks that's usually made of metal. She asks if he's planning to go dig up ore himself, and Node immediately tells her there's no way he's doing that, clarifying that what he's actually looking to make is a suit of scale mail that's literally made out of animal scales. He knows that when people hear the term, they usually just picture high-end gear made from legendary dragon scales. But even though wyvern or sub-dragon gear is technically scale armor, it's a completely different level from what he's planning. Elsa doesn't seem too focused on the technical talk though, so she just calls out for another round of ale. She adds an order of nuts to the tab while the bartender tells her it's on the way, letting Node finish his thought about how the armor he's planning to build actually uses materials from much weaker monsters to keep things simple. Node explains that processing fish or reptile scales can make gear as strong as metal, and it's a cheap way to make armor last. The bartender drops off their drinks and a bowl of snacks, but Node keeps the conversation going anyway. Elsa just chugs her ale, while Node realizes she isn't really listening to his story about learning gear specs from the old blacksmith. She holds her hand out and asks what his point is, so Node just stares at her for a second before she smirks and tells him that if he's got this all planned out, then he should already know what materials they're looking for. Node says of course he does, and pulls out a reference book to show her the details, flipping to a specific page, and telling her there are 5 main things they need to track down. The list covers everything from waterfish scales and venomous snake skin to rare great serpent parts and fish dragon scales. Elsa looks over the requirements and admits that while the fish and snakes are easy, getting everything else might be a huge pain. Node crosses his arms and agrees, noting that the biggest headache is definitely going to be dealing with the Great Serpent. Node thinks about the Great Serpent and how just one of those things in the deep marsh is way more dangerous than a whole pack of rock wolves. They crawl right along the ground, so even though they're massive, they're almost impossible to see. Elsa points out that fighting in a swamp with zero visibility and terrible footing is a death trap, and unless they have a pro scout, Node is just going to get stuck and eaten head first. But Node is set on his plan, explaining that normal scales aren't any better than what he has, so he needs those specific great skills for his new plating. Elsa looks him in the eye and says she knows he's trying to be cheap, but asks why he doesn't just buy some regular armor from the shop, since even if it's not perfect, it would still be plenty for the kind of crystal rank jobs they're doing. She says it's pretty obvious that just paying for gear is faster than a dangerous hunt, and while Node knows she's right, he still can't bring himself to do it, mostly because he realizes he'd need 3 times their current budget to actually afford the good stuff. Elsa tells him to just keep the option in the back of his head, while she finishes off her drink, leaving Node totally stuck between trying to find a way to triple his money or risking his life against the Great Serpent. Node is just hanging out when someone spots him and calls out his name. It's Zinnius, who walks up looking pretty happy to see him. He mentions it's been a minute and asks if Node's been away on some long mission lately. Zinnius explains that he's actually the one who was gone, finishing up a long-term request for hunting and gathering way out in the Western Kingdom. He looks around and asks why Node is all by himself today, since it's definitely not a common sight for him. Zinnius laughs it off and says his own group is on a 2-week break while everyone handles their own business, and mentions that Lysa's is currently at the capital's temple. She's training as a priestess because she really wants to level up her healing magic. Since her training is going to take a whole month, the rest of the party just decided to call it a vacation for now. Jagos is spending his time off differently, heading out into the wilderness to keep practicing with his spear, while Illumina made the trip back home to attend her brother's wedding. Node asks if the whole group is from the same hometown, and Zinnius tells him he's got a great memory because they've all been friends since they were kids. Node asks where Shino is, and Zinnius tells him the guy is currently off on vacation in the royal capital. Zinnius mentions he heard Node is out here working every single day, and asks if he's actually getting enough sleep, explaining that this line of work is a total mental drain, so most people usually take way more time off. Node looks pretty exhausted as he admits he just doesn't have the luxury of taking it easy right now. He realizes Elsa gave him that same concerned look the other day, while Zinnius tells him he's only bringing it up because he's worried. Deep down, Node knows he wouldn't be killing himself with work if the family actually had some money to spare. Node insists he's getting the bare minimum rest to stay alive, then flips the script and asks what Zinnius does when he's off. Zinnius explains he was going to practice his sword skills, but since drills are boring, he wanted a quest instead, and that's when he spotted Node. Node asks what he's planning to hunt, and Zinnius mentions there's something he's looking for out in the Marshland. He hangs out with his drink, admitting he was secretly looking for a chance to join up with another party for the trip. Node tells Zinnius that since he's headed to the marsh, he's got some business to take care of there too, asking if Zinnius is just hunting for armor materials. He points out that with Shino on the team, they won't have to worry about any giant snakes trying to ambush them while they're out there. Node cuts to the chase and asks Zinnius what he's actually looking for, and the question seems to catch Zinnius totally off guard. Zinnius starts acting really awkward, looking down at his drink while he tries to find the right words to explain. He finally admits he's searching for a crystal flower, specifically a rare pink one, while looking a bit embarrassed about it. The crystal flower is a pretty unique plant that looks exactly like a rose made of glass sitting in the middle of the brush. Usually, these things are blue and grow around the royal capital, getting their name from the fact that their petals and stems are completely clear. The versions that grow in the marshes are special though, since they almost never turn pink unless it's a very specific time of year. There's actually a pretty famous legend about these flowers that started in a land far away and eventually spread all the way to Hamel. The story goes that an adventurer once fell in love with a noblewoman, but their relationship was strictly against the rules of society. The legend says the only thing a lowly adventurer can really offer a noble lady is a crystal flower, which carries the meaning of simple affection. But in the story, the flower the guy found wasn't the usual blue kind. Instead, it was a glowing, vibrant pink. Finding that color was supposed to be impossible, so the lady decided to make their love work and they eventually got married. See, the blue one just means you like someone, but the pink one means you'll love them forever, making it a huge deal. Node leans over Zinnius's shoulder with a big grin, asking if he's actually planning to confess his feelings to Lysa's after all, and Zinnius just looks down and nods while his face turns bright red. So Node decides he's definitely going to help his friend out. Node's actually surprised they weren't already a couple since they're always stuck together. Even he could see the vibes they were giving off. Zinnias heads off to talk to Kagos and Shino about the trip, while Node says he'll go find Elsa to get her on board too. Once Node explains the whole romantic situation, he asks Elsa what she thinks, and she's just standing there blushing with stars in her eyes. She says she's always dreamed of a story like that and she's totally ready to head to the swamp and find that flower. Zinnias greets Elsa, mentioning he's already heard plenty about her from Node and it's great to finally meet, while Shino jumps in with a wave, introducing herself to the group's newest member with plenty of energy. And when Shino asks where Jagos is, Zinnias looks over the paperwork and explains the other quests were already grabbed, so it's just the 4 of them today. Elsa looks up and asks what kind of work they've actually got lined up for this trip, so Zinnias breaks it down, saying they're doing some gathering and viper gland harvesting without any big snakes to worry about, while Shino reminds everyone to pack their repellent. The group gets their 2 wagons loaded up and ready to move out from the city center, starting the long trek toward the marshlands, where the paths are tight and the water reflects the bright morning sun through the trees. The wagons rumble through the tall grass as they get closer to the site, and Node hops into the back to help secure the supplies. Elsa watches Node work and admits she's impressed by how low maintenance he is, especially since she expected him to be way more of a gloomy guy, but Shino just leans back and says they're lucky it's autumn, because she's heard this place is a total nightmare to work in during the summer heat. Zinnias talks about his time out west over the summer, says it was actually pretty nice out there, before asking how the others spent their break. Node mentions they spent their time hunting in the cool forests and mountains, while Shino thinks back and says taking a swamp quest in that heat would have been total hell. The group reaches the edge of the marsh, and Shino raises a hand to signal they're moving out, telling everyone she'll lead the way while they cover the back. The 4 of them spread out across the tall grass to start gathering. Everyone stays low, focused on picking the right plants for their quest. Node senses something just as a massive snake lunges out from the brush. It moves fast, aiming straight for Shino as she turns to face it. Shino doesn't even flinch, spinning around to land a massive kick right against the snake's head. The force of the hit sends the monster reeling. They finish the snake off quickly and get right back to the mission. Shino doesn't waste any time and heads back out front to keep scouting the area. Shino looks back with a grin and says having a dedicated scout makes this whole thing way easier, but Node just stays humble, telling her it's just part of his job. Zinnias chimes in to tell Node that they're always having a much easier time because of him, which makes Shino feel pretty good, as she says she's honored by the praise. The path ahead is covered in clear marks through the mud. Node points out that the tracks are so easy to see here that the rest of the job should be a breeze. Node mentions that Shino is actually pretty amazing, and Elsa agrees, saying she really wishes they had a scout for their own team. Node thinks about helping Zinnias and the guys hit crystal rank, but with Shino already being a lieutenant and too many frontliners, the backline would be a mess. Moving up to iron rank means they might need to look for more people, but Node stops mid-thought when he sees something weird on the ground. He points out something strange in the grass, and then he sees it, realizing something is very wrong. The whole group stops dead in their tracks in the middle of these giant flowers, just staring up at a massive threat. Node tenses up and yells for everyone to look out, right as a giant snake with massive fangs lunges straight at them. Elsa says the thing is absolutely huge, as it towers over the 4 of them like it's nothing. The snake slams its head down with crazy force, completely wrecking the ground where they were just standing. Node can't believe the strength this monster has, but he keeps his guard up while the dust settles. He warns the rest of the group to stay away from its mouth, because if that thing bites you, it's going to wrap its body around you and it's over. Node doesn't waste a second, lunging forward with his sword drawn to close the gap as he and Elsa unleash a synchronized attack, their blades cutting through the air with crazy speed, and Node grits his teeth, putting every bit of strength he has into a heavy strike that connects right against the snake's thick scales. The monster snaps back, its massive jaws opening wide to swallow him whole, but Node just barely dives out of the way, showing just how huge this thing really is compared to him. While Node keeps it busy, the rest of the group jumps in, with Elsa leading the charge and landing a brutal hit on its neck. Elsa screams for Genius to take his shot, and he yells back for everyone to leave the rest to him as he pushes forward, and Genius delivers a massive finishing blow that sends the snake's head flying back, finally ending the fight for good. With the threat gone, the group finally catches their breath. Someone mentions they're finally done, while another says it's time to start carving the snake up. Node stands over the fallen monster, admitting he really didn't know how things were going to go after getting blindsided by an ambush like that. He looks down at the massive fangs on the ground, saying it's honestly scary to think about what might have happened if even one of them hadn't been there to help. Node tries to brush it off, saying the monster was just crazy fast, but Shino still feels bad and apologizes for missing the sneak attack. Later on, Node watches Shino work on the carcass and asks if she actually learned butchery techniques too. Genius just smiles at the scene, saying it all just proves how much they've really grown lately. The group moves out through a field filled with white flowers, Taking a second to appreciate the view, Node calls out to Genius to show him something, while Elsa and the others wait nearby in the grass. Genius looks down at the flowers and gives a quiet nod, agreeing with whatever Node is saying. He picks up one of the crystal-like flowers and says thank you while holding it up. Later at a tavern, Node mentions that the snake meal Shino cooked up was actually great, and Elsa says camping always feels fulfilling. Node looks toward the door and says speak of the devil, noticing some familiar faces arriving, and just like that, the whole rookie crew shows up together, looking like they're in the best mood ever. Node notices Genius is finally finished with his own mission too, and the two friends share a quick moment. Checking the list, it looks like all the materials for Node's scale armor are finally coming together. They've got the serpent and venom snake parts cleared, so the only things left to find are some water fish and sea drake scales. Node looks over his notes thinking about the water fish. They're ocean monsters known for being pretty nasty, and seeing one in action is enough to freak anyone out. These things are about the size of a kid but covered in tough scales and teeth like saws. They're mean meat-eaters, and getting jumped by them out at sea is usually bad news. But at the tavern, the talk is all about how good they taste. Someone mentions the meat is thick and flavorful while Elsa just daydreams about the food. Node points out that since they're in season, the southern fishing ports should have plenty of work. He suggests they head down there, making the others ask if they're going as guards. The job is actually pretty popular since the fish go crazy once they're hooked. The pay is just okay, but being able to keep the extra catch for dinner makes it a hit with everyone. Node thinks the whole setup sounds like a solid plan, and even Elsa seems to be on board with the idea, though she seems a bit confused about the catching part. Node just laughs and tells her that's exactly what they're doing. Node gets all hyped up and says they can go waterfish fishing too. He explains these fish are incredibly strong and pull so hard that it's actually a super popular hobby for people. The pull from their massive bodies is so intense that anglers feel like they're getting dragged into the sea, but Node thinks getting bitten is just part of the fun. Elsa starts to lose it and tells him to stop. She pushes him back, saying she gets that he's obsessed with fishing, but the waterfish isn't the problem. She wants to know what his plan is for the ichthyosaur. Node just ignores her and says the really technical part of fishing is just getting started. But Elsa keeps trying to shut him down with a giant stop sign. It turns out ichthyosaurs are technically classified as fish instead of sub-dragons, even though they're massive. These things are the size of whales and fight like real dragons. Since they can sink anything smaller than a large ship, the guild only lets copper-rank adventurers hunt them. Elsa points out that they aren't strong enough to handle a monster like that right now. She asks if they can just use metal for the armor instead, but Node is convinced he can pull it off. He explains that using high-rank monster scales would make the armor's defense way better than anything else. Elsa asks how he even plans to get the materials, and Node just says he'll fish it up. She gets even more stressed wondering how he'll actually kill the thing once it's on the line. Node looks totally serious and tells her they're actually fishing for octopus. Elsa just stands there looking completely done with the whole conversation. Elsa sounds pretty confused and just repeats the word octopus back to him. Node ignores the look on her face and asks if she's ever even heard of a box octopus before. It's basically an aquatic monster about the size of a grown man, but it's really not that dangerous. He explains that even a jade-rank adventurer could take one down without much trouble. And while the monster looks a bit creepy up close, the meat is the real talking point. People are usually split on it because it's so stretchy, so it's mostly just a local delicacy for gourmets. But regardless of the taste, anglers are obsessed with catching them for quests or just for the hobby. Node points out the info in their book while Elsa leans in, still looking a bit unsure about the plan. The whole reason they have that name is because of the box they carry around. It's a pretty smart setup since the box serves as both their home and their personal suit of armor. Apparently they scavenge all kinds of hard junk from the seabed to build those shells. Node thinks out loud, wondering if they just use basic stuff like pebbles or seashells they find lying around, or maybe even old fish bones they find on the ocean floor. But that's not the part that actually matters. Node mentions that some of these octopuses pick up human items like coins or silver candlesticks from old shipwrecks. He adds that there are even stories about some of them carrying actual gold bars. Elsa completely loses it and yells about the gold bars. Suddenly looking way more excited than she was a second ago, Node laughs and points out how she's suddenly interested now that there's a payday. He tells her there's actually one more massive treasure waiting for them at the bottom of the sea. Node gets a serious look on his face and holds up a finger, telling Elsa the big prize is ichthyosaur scales. She practically jumps out of her skin, asking if a box octopus could actually be carrying something that valuable. Node stays calm and keeps reading, explaining how these fish dragons shed their scales, which sometimes get tangled up in fishing nets or gear. He whispers that it's a secret among anglers that lucky low-rank adventurers can find them hidden inside an octopus's den. Elsa gets this greedy look in her eyes and says the monster is basically a living treasure chest. Node shuts his book with a smile, saying this kind of discovery is exactly what being an adventurer is all about. And since everyone calls it the treasure octopus, now he tells Elsa they're heading out to catch one immediately. Moving on, they meet up with a merchant who's glad to have them along. Node confirms they're ready for the escort job to Port Els, a harbor town down south. The merchant mentions the carriage is already packed with cargo, so it might be a tight fit, but Node says it's no big deal. It turns out tight was an understatement since they're all smashed together with two other guys and a bunch of luggage. One of the guys asks if they're also adventurers looking for a ride, and Elsa just looks confused and asks how he figured that out. Node explains that the main roads are safe because of the regular patrols, and most people just hire adventurers for cheap to fill seats. The whole group just sits there in the dark, cramped carriage while it bumps along the road. Node looks over and sees Elsa looking totally drained, so he asks if she's dying of boredom. He tells her that boredom is actually a tougher opponent than an enemy that doesn't show up, and Elsa has to admit he's right. Finally, they make it to Port Els. Node looks out at the waves and says it's the ocean for sure, and Elsa just stares out at the water. They head inside the guild, which Node notices is built of stone to handle the sea breeze, but Elsa is busy smelling the food. Looking over the board, they see jobs for ship escorts and sea beast hunts. Node asks what she wants to do, then finds a specific post. He tells her it's a request from the fishery guild to join a boat crew and help them catch some water fish. Node explains the gig involves both fishing and fighting, so they need to head to the harbor for the details. And Elsa is ready to move. They walk through the busy port town where vendors are everywhere, yelling about their imported liquor and trying to make a sale. They walk through the market where a vendor is shouting about a famous blade from the east. Another guy tries to sell Elsa a hair ornament, while Node just comments on how busy the street is. They finally spot the building they're looking for and head inside. Node can't get over how much energy is in the air, right before guessing it's just the sea air getting to everyone, as he checks in with the guild about the quest. The receptionist tells them they'll be working as crew on a boat, but warns them about a quota. Node realizes the pay depends on the catch, then asks if there's a way to get those fish scales. She tells him they can keep anything over the quota plus any other monsters they catch. So Node is impressed by the quick answer, but she says adventurers ask about that all the time. Soon enough, the two of them are out on the open sea, ready to get to work. Node checks in on Elsa to see if she's doing all right since she's looking a little nervous. She admits she's never fished a day in her life, panicking over how to even get the bait on the hook. Node just watches her struggle and tells her she's doing just fine, so one of the crew members walks them through the rules, explaining that every catch needs to go into a specific tank. Elsa stands there shivering a bit, mentioned how cold it's getting out on the water. The guy tells her not to worry because they use magic tools to keep everything fresh. He yells out that they're almost at the spot, and the massive wooden ship cuts through the waves under a clear sky, finally reaching the fishing grounds. It doesn't take long before one of the sailors starts pointing and losing his mind over what he's seeing. Elsa is already hauling in a massive water fish, acting like it's the easiest thing in the world. Node can't even believe it, asking her how she's this good when she just said she was a total beginner. The rest of the crew is just as shocked, realizing that both of them are absolute naturals at this, as Node stays calm and focused while Elsa keeps yanking monsters out of the ocean one after another. And after seeing the mountain of fish they've caught, a sailor asks if they're sure they aren't actually full-time fishermen. Node just looks away and apologizes for causing a scene. One of the sailors is completely losing it, yelling about how the fish tank is already stuffed to the brim and asking what he's supposed to do next. The guy is in total shock since he's never seen anything like this happen before, and he starts shouting across the deck for the captain to come handle the situation. The captain doesn't even turn around, just telling the crew to go find another spot for them to fish. The sailors scramble to get it done, blown away by how fast they filled the first tank and worrying the next one is going to overflow just as quick. Moving on, Node sits back and decides it's finally time to stop messing around and start aiming for his real target. He reaches into his gear and pulls out some wild boar fat he brought along specifically for this, so he drops the line deep into the water where a massive tentacle suddenly reaches out and snaps up the bait. Node feels the heavy tug on his rod and knows right away that the monster he was waiting for finally showed up. Node feels the massive weight on his line but keeps his cool, telling himself he's just testing the waters. He stands his ground on the deck as the creature pulls, repeating to himself to stay calm and not panic. He grits his teeth and puts his whole body into it, leaning back until the rod is practically doubling over. The strain is clear on his face as someone on the ship yells out, asking if he's actually hooked something huge. Suddenly the water explodes and the crew loses it, shouting that he actually caught a treasure octopus. Node hauls the massive beast clean out of the ocean and drops it right onto the deck. He and Elsa stand over the giant creature, finally seeing the weird stone-like shell it uses for protection. Moving on, the scene shifts back to land where the horses are waiting for them to start the next leg of their trip. Elsa stretches out and talks about how much fun the fishing was, and Node admits he kind of wishes they could have stayed a bit longer. She mentions the captain even wanted him to stick around for a few more days, but Node says he's had his fill of fishing for now, leaving Elsa laughing as they move on. The captain tells Node to hit him up for another request sometime if he's down, and Node can tell the guy is actually being serious later on. Node gets a good look at the scales he harvested and is blown away by how huge they are. He realizes the tree ring patterns mean they're from a really old beast, which makes them perfect for the new armor he needs. He and Elsa head back into town to visit the workshop, reaching out and grabbing the door handle, walking right in as the bell rings. The blacksmith looks up from his work to see who's showing up this time. The blacksmith asks if he's back for something else, so Node drops the massive bag on the counter and tells him these are the materials they talked about. But that's not all. Node pulls out some special rocks and sets them down, leaving the blacksmith looking pretty confused for a second. The craftsman picks one up and inspects it closely, quickly identifying the stones as high-grade emerald ore. He puts on his eyepiece to get a better look and tells Node there's enough here to make a full set of weapons for one person. Node can't even believe his luck. Elsa pipes up and reminds him that since she gave him the ore, he's gotta help her get her own weapon made next time. She tells him she's gonna need some serious monster materials for that, so Node starts wondering just how crazy of a hunt he's in for. The blacksmith leans over and asks to see the sword on Node's hip. Node is a bit caught off guard but says sure, reaching down to pull the blade out. The craftsman holds it up to the light and suggests they should probably just reinforce the thing since they have the materials, but Node just stands there looking completely shocked by the idea. The blacksmith doesn't seem to notice his reaction and keeps inspecting the metal. He taps the blade and mentions he noticed this when he sharpened it before, but the sword is actually made really well. He can tell the smith who forged it was a pro, even if the steel itself is just basic stuff. He jokes that they still aren't quite on his level though, which makes Node think back to when he was just a kid. He remembers looking up at his dad and asking if it was really true that he could finally get his own gear. His father told him it was about time he had his own sword anyway, leaving the kid clutching his small bag of coins. His dad put a hand on his shoulder and told him to pick the weapon himself, since judging your own gear is a big part of the job, and Node gave him a serious nod. But looking down at the 3 tiny coins in his hand, he realized that choosing a good sword was going to be pretty much impossible with that budget. He walked away feeling a little defeated, thinking about how his family is actually way poorer than he realized. Looking at the coins, Node realizes that at this rate, he's probably stuck with some cheap piece of junk or a practice blade made by an apprentice. He walks into a shop anyway and calls out that he's looking for a sword, catching the blacksmith off guard. Node holds out his hand and admits that his tiny pile of coins is all he has for a budget, which leaves the blacksmith looking totally stunned. The guy just scoffs and says that's basically just pocket change for a kid, turning back to his work and leaving Node to look around on his own. He spots a massive wooden barrel overflowing with old blades and decides to start digging through the pile. He reaches in and grabs a hilt, pulling a sword out to see if any of them are actually worth using. He tries one that's way too heavy to even lift and spends a while carefully checking out every single blade he can find, until he finally pulls out a straight sword that feels different. He looks at the steel and realizes right away that this is the one, so he runs over and slams the blade onto the counter. He tells the blacksmith he's taking this one, which nearly makes the guy jump out of his skin. The smith asks if the kid is seriously still here, but Node just drops his 3 coins and tells him to take the payment and hurry it up. Node looks down at the sword in his hands. He thinks about his father and remembers how back then the blade felt as huge as a greatsword. The blacksmith looks at the weapon on the counter and asks what the plan is, specifically if he's looking for an upgrade or a total replacement. Node doesn't even have to think about it, he smiles and says it's an upgrade of course, looking pretty hyped about the whole thing. As he heads out, Node thinks about how it's been a really long time since he's just taken a stroll through the royal capital like this. The blacksmith hands over a temporary blade made by his apprentice, explaining he's lending it so Node's hip doesn't feel lonely while his main sword gets worked on, though Node quickly realizes the loaner is about as dull as a butter knife. Node decides he'll spend some time gathering materials to earn some extra cash for meals, but then he spots something that catches his eye. It's a really nice comb sitting in a shop window, and he can't help but think about how great it would look on his sister Lilia. He starts doing the math. He got a solid bonus from that fishing job. But after factoring in his new gear and the family expenses, there's just nothing left. He thinks about his sisters and how happy they'd be, but he has to keep walking, leaving the expensive gift behind in the window. Node lets out a heavy sigh. He tells himself that someday, he's definitely going to buy some real souvenirs for all his siblings. Node realizes the family cash situation is still a total wreck. Alec keeps coming to him for advice on how to raise more funds. And it's a lot to handle since most adventurers his age are just out there living it up. They're spending all their gold on food, fun, or girls, while he's been doing nothing but grinding for the last 6 months straight. He barely spends a dime on himself, only buying the absolute basics for his gear so he can dump every last bit of gold back into the household budget. Genius and the others think he's being way too cheap, but he feels like they finally have some breathing room. If he can just hit crystal rank, the family debt will finally start to shrink for real. Once that happens, he's planning on finally giving Alec and the other servants the pay they actually deserve. They never once thought about ditching the Ferris house. They even took minimum wage just to stay. He really wants Lilia to have some nice clothes now that she's older, and he's set on getting brand new outfits for Ellen and Iris. Plus, he just wants his younger siblings to be able to eat their fill of good food for once. He grips his tag tight, knowing he's gotta work even harder than before. The thought of his loyal staff keeps him going. He knows if he keeps earning like this, he can finally treat Alec and the others the right way. Looking at his sisters, he imagines them finally getting those new clothes, and the great meals they've been missing out on, making all the hard work worth it. Node grips his equipment tight, telling himself he's got to push even harder to make things work. He lets out a long groan while stretching his back to work out the tension, and looking around the park at the kids playing, he decides it's finally time to head back home, but he stops when something catches his eye near the trees, wondering what he's looking at. Node realizes it's his sister Hannah standing there. She's dressed in a maid outfit and looking pretty happy, so he ducks behind a fence with some kids to hide. Remembering her job is nearby and trying to see who she's talking to, his head goes straight to the worst case, thinking if some guy is giving her trouble, he's going to make him pay, but then he sees her just walking off casually with the person, and his protective mode totally deflates. He scratches his head, feeling a bit silly for overreacting since it was probably just someone she knows. Moving on, Node heads home while planning to clean his gear before dinner, plus he remembers he promised to play with Ellen later. The whole Ferris family is gathered in the massive dining hall for dinner. The long table is packed with kids while the maids and staff keep the food moving. One of the older sisters tells little Milia to sit properly in her chair, trying to keep some order during the meal. Another sister asks Albero if he wants another helping. He just tells her he'll get some more later. Little Helena gets called over as she struggles to carry a big bowl of soup with both her hands, and Node takes a second to help one of the youngest kids. He shows her how to hold her spoon and tells her to bring it all the way up to her mouth. He guides her hand through the motion, encouraging her to give it a shot herself. She gives him a big yes brother and starts eating. Node can't help but smile, remembering how Hannah used to look after him just like this when he was a rowdy little brat. Suddenly, Node's father speaks up from the end of the table. He tells Albero the army is looking for more dragon knights, which is a massive chance to get promoted. Albero takes it seriously and tells his father he'll work as hard as he can to make sure he gets picked for the spot. The younger kids are a bit lost though. One of them asks Node what a dragon knight even is, and if it's different from the regular royal knights. Node starts breaking it down for the younger kids. He holds up his hand and tells them there are actually 4 different knight orders in the kingdom. First up is the Regional Knight Order. It's basically a big group made of soldiers from all the different lords across the north, south, east, and west. Then there's the Royal Knight Order. That's the group their dad and Albero are actually part of right now. This order is the biggest one of the bunch. It's mostly made up of kids from warrior families, landowning nobles, and top military school grads. The third group is the Imperial Guard. Their whole job is protecting the king, so they only pick the absolute best nobles from the royal knights. Finally, there's the Iron Dragon Knight Order. These are the elite riders who go into battle on the backs of flying dragons. And since the kingdom is getting more dragons, they need more riders to fill the slots, making it the perfect chance for someone to move up the ranks. One of the little girls jumps up from her seat. She asks why they can't just become the king's personal guards instead. Node tells her to sit back down and explains that those spots are all about personal trust. Their great-grandfather only got in because he was best friends with the king. The conversation shifts a bit after that. Node mentions to everyone that he actually spotted their older sister Hannah while he was walking through town. Node brings up their older sister and asks how she's been lately. Lilia lights up the second she hears her name, looking totally hyped as she asks if Hannah is doing all right. The younger kids just sit there looking confused. They're so small they don't even really know who Hannah is. Node points out that since she's always away working for another noble family, the little ones wouldn't have many memories. But Lilia mentions she only makes it back home a few times a year anyway. She leans in, asking Node if their sister had anything specific to say, but Node has to break the news that he only spotted her from a distance. She looked like she was in the middle of something, so he didn't want to get in the way and didn't actually get to talk to her. He figures Lilia probably knows more than he does at this point since he's been busy adventuring, leaving Lilia feeling pretty bummed out. The family keeps sitting around the big table under the chandelier. It's a full house with everyone finally together for a bit. Servants keep the food moving and wheel the youngest babies around the hall. It's a lot of work keeping a family this huge fed and happy. Eventually, the long day catches up with the toddlers. They start getting fussy and losing it at the table as things wind down. Later on, Node is back in the zone out in the woods. Elsa yells out that the monster is heading his way. Node just grips his sword and tells her he's got it. The target is a berserk bear. It looks like a normal animal at first, but under all that thick fur is just a massive block of pure muscle. These things are usually pretty chill, but the second something sets them off, their eyes turn blood red and they go on a total rampage. Node notices this one's eyes are already glowing bright red. He tells himself he doesn't care what made it snap. He's just there to finish the job, and the bear doesn't wait around, lunging forward with a roar. Node lets out a shout of his own as he prepares to meet the attack head-on, looking for any opening as the massive beast swings a heavy clawed arm at his head. He keeps his cool and ducks low, sliding right under the strike. He realizes his blade can actually bite through the monster's tough hide and lands a clean slash across its face. The bear lets out a deafening roar that echoes through the trees. Node ignores the noise, seeing the beast is completely wide open for a follow-up. The monster screams in pain as another hit connects, leaving it reeling and struggling to keep its balance while Elsa suddenly jumps into the mix. She yells at Node not to forget she's part of this fight too. She swings her weapon with everything she's got, landing a heavy blow that sends a shockwave through the bear's skull and finishes it for good. Node throws himself into the path of the beast, yelling that he won't let it get away with its attack. He catches its attention, shouting to lure the monster toward him while its massive claws swipe at the air where he just was. The two of them stand their ground against the bleeding monster. Node tells Elsa they're almost done and just need one last push. Later back at the guild, the receptionist greets them with a smile as she starts checking over their quest report. She confirms everything is in order, taking the proof of the bear hunt right there at the front desk. She lets them know the hunt is officially finished and tells them both they did a great job out there, and then she pulls out a big bag of coins. She hands over their payment for the job, but says there's actually something else. Node looks down at what she's holding and realizes these are their brand new guild cards. They officially got promoted to crystal rank. The shiny new tag proves they've finally moved up to the big leagues. Node can't hide his grin as he looks at the crystal card, immediately calling out to Elsa to share the moment. Node gets caught off guard when a huge adventurer slams an arm around him, laughing loudly while asking if the kid and his partner actually hit crystal rank already. The news spreads through the tavern instantly, drawing a crowd of veterans who can't believe how fast they're climbing. One old-timer starts telling stories about his own rookie days, but he's cut off by someone yelling that it's time to celebrate. They order a round for the whole room, making a toast to the two newest crystal ranks as the veterans crowd around to congratulate them. Node gets his head rubbed by the big guys while Elsa just focuses on her drink. And before long, the party gets so wild that they both end up completely passed out at the table. A while later, Node finally wakes up and sighs about how they didn't even get a chance to celebrate as a duo. Elsa just looks at her new card and says she didn't mind the chaos since everyone was so sincere. She smiles, happy they finally made it this far. Node lets out a quiet sigh as he thinks about the journey. The ranking system for adventurers actually has 10 different stages, and while crystal rank is only third from the bottom, it's a huge deal because it means they aren't just common pebbles anymore. Now that they're officially full-fledged adventurers, they'll be trusted with high-stakes escort missions and delivering actual valuables. Elsa smiles, asking Node if he realizes it's been 6 months since she first found him broke and struggling. Node smiles back, telling her that thanks to her help, his family is finally safe and they've even managed to gather all those rare materials. He realizes most people take years to hit crystal, but they did it fast because having a partner you can trust makes all the difference. Elsa agrees, pointing out how much stronger they've both gotten since that first day they teamed up. Node stays quiet for a second, then softly calls out Elsa's name across the table. She looks up from her drink, sounding a bit curious as she asks him what's on his mind. Node just looks at her and says thanks for everything they've been through. She gives a small nod, agreeing with him completely. Node sits across from Elsa at the tavern and lets her know that their partnership is officially ending today. They've finally hit crystal rank, and Elsa can't help but smile a bit sadly while thinking about how they're splitting up right after making it so far. She admits she's going to be pretty lonely now, then asks if he's definitely going back to his hometown for his family. Node looks at her and tells her to take care of herself, and Elsa just tells him to stay safe and not get hurt. They raise their drinks high to celebrate making it to crystal rank together, shouting cheers as they clink their mugs. Node downs his drink in one go and Elsa laughs, telling him he's got a great drinking style. They clink their mugs one last time, toasting to their new beginnings and whatever comes next. Later on, the tavern is quiet with empty mugs left on the table. Node grabs his bag to head out, but then he hears someone call his name. He turns around to see his mother standing there with her arms crossed, and she tells him that even though he just got home, they need to talk in her room. Node quickly agrees, telling her he'll be there as soon as he gets out of his armor. Node heads down the hallway toward his mother's room, sweating buckets because he has absolutely no idea what he did wrong. He's racking his brain for any reason he'd be getting scolded right now. He stops at the door and announces that he's here, and his mother simply tells him to come inside. Once he's in the room, Node tries to break the tension by asking what it is she wants to talk about. His mother stands by the window looking out at the grounds, then turns to tell him that a marriage proposal has actually come in for their sister Hannah. Node's face lights up and he says that's amazing news for her, mostly just relieved that he isn't the one in the hot seat for once. But his mother's expression stays cold and serious, making Node realize this isn't exactly a happy visit. He tentatively calls out to her to see what's up. She admits the whole thing is basically falling apart before it even starts, and Node asks why that would happen, finally figuring out that this is the real reason he was summoned. His mother explains that the guy is a baron and a friend of the noble family Hannah works for at the royal palace. The problem is that the guy's family has a pretty low opinion of the Ferris house. Apparently, they've heard some bad rumors about them lately. It turns out the baron's family is convinced Hannah is just a gold digger who's only interested in marrying him for his money. Node thinks about how he and his brothers have been working hard to pay things off, but the family is still drowning in debt. It's a lot to handle, so his mother explains that they need to at least show they're capable of paying back what they owe to save face. Node asks her for the specific amount they need right now, and he tries to get himself hyped up to go out and earn enough for Hannah's wedding. He's feeling the pressure but is ready to put in the work, thinking that since it's snowing and Elsa isn't around, he can hog all the high-paying winter gathering jobs for himself. He figures if he grinds through a bunch of them, he might pull in 20 or 30 silver coins. But then his mother drops the hammer and says they actually need 200 silver coins. Node just stands there looking completely pale, like his soul left his body because he can't even process the number she just said. While he's glitching out, his mother casually moves on and asks what the total debt for the whole family is at this point. The two of them stand there looking at a massive scroll that lists every single thing the family owes. It's way longer than he expected. Node's jaw literally drops as he asks how they even managed to borrow that much money. He jokes about whether they were secret high-ranking lords or something, but his mother just looks tired and reminds him they're low-level nobles who barely see 30 silver coins a year. She explains that everything was actually going fine until their big brother Albiro came along. She tells him that back when she was pregnant with Hannah, a war broke out with the country next door. It turns out Node's father had to take out loans just to afford the gear to go fight in it. The mother continues the story, explaining how the family eventually landed the official positions they hold today, but it turns out that was just the beginning of their troubles. She folds her hands together as she explains that from that point on she and the father grew even closer. Node just stands there looking pretty tired of hearing about his parents' romance, while he realizes the debt just kept piling up. Between the costs of raising a huge family, granddad's funeral, and more war gear, they were underwater before they could even start paying things back. And with interest added on, even those 200 silver coins won't clear the slate. Node thinks to himself that his family's financial mess is actually kind of impressive in a bad way, especially since some people have been waiting nearly 20 years to get their money back. The mother explains that paying back only a few people would just make everyone else angry, and Node can't even believe people have been waiting 2 decades because now they have to pay for Hannah's wedding. The neighbors are already talking, saying if the family has money for a big party, they should be using it to pay off their loans instead. So the mother wants to settle things with the loudest complainers all at once. She's trying to keep the family name from being dragged through the mud any further, knowing that Hannah's future in-laws are already getting cold feet because of the rumors. If Node can just find a way to get those 200 silver coins, the wedding can happen without a hitch, which leads to Node getting totally fired up. He clenches his fist and tells her he's on it, promising to do absolutely whatever he can to get the cash. Node looks at the small item in his hand, thinking to himself that there's no way he can actually tell his mom how he feels, so he starts doing the math on those 200 silver coins. That much money is basically what an entire small territory brings in for a whole year, and when he compares that to a normal adventurer's life, the gap is just insane. Even a high-level crystal rank adventurer only makes about 40 silver coins a year. Node sits on the ground with his head in his hands, totally stressed out and wondering how he's ever going to pull this off, but he doesn't stay down for long. He bundles up in heavy winter gear and heads out into a freezing mountain range, trudging through the deep snow until something catches his eye. He spots a pair of glowing gems half buried in the ground and realizes he finally found what he was looking for. These things are ice spirit stones, super rare magic stones that you can only find naturally when it's freezing outside during the winter months, and Node starts loading them up. He looks at his massive pack and wonders what the total payout will be, knowing he's still nowhere near that 200 silver goal. The bag is so heavy he almost falls over, muttering that it was a close call since the weight nearly made him sink right into the snow, so he stops to tighten his straps and get his gear sitting right. He tells himself it's good to go now, looking determined to keep grinding through the cold. Node trudges through the deep snow with his gear, thinking to himself that this winter cold is way more dangerous than any monster. He's just glad he didn't listen to that shopkeeper and kept his old leather armor. It's the only thing keeping him from freezing right now, and even though the extra costs for his gear modifications were a bit high, he knows it was worth it. Being able to actually move in this environment is a must if he wants to survive, so he keeps his eyes peeled while looking out over the mountain. He thinks about how dead quiet everything is out here, but then he spots a weird shimmering light in the distance that catches his attention immediately. He stares at the sparkles over the frozen plains and wonders if he's looking at actual ice spirits. Node remembers that spirits like those are notorious for being pranksters. The problem is they're so powerful that even a harmless joke from them can easily wreck a normal person, so he decides it's best to get out of there before they even spot him. He's not looking to get turned into minced meat just because some spirit thought it'd be funny to mess with him. He keeps his head down and keeps walking, telling himself that he should be hitting the foothills any minute now, but out of nowhere, a massive sound echoes through the valley. Node freezes up as the air pressure hits him, sensing something huge is close by. He dives face first into the snow and tells himself not to move a single muscle. A giant shadow sweeps across the ground right over his head, and he looks up just enough to see a massive winged beast flying through the storm. He stays pinned to the ground, watching the monster disappear into the clouds while he tries to stay hidden. Node stays huddled in the deep snow, glancing over his shoulder to check the sky. He wonders if that massive thing finally left, and as the air settles, he looks up to confirm it was definitely a wyvern. He's safe for now, but the trip back is rough, leading to Node slumped over a table at the local tavern, looking completely defeated. The waitress stands over him and asks for his order, but he can only manage a miserable groan. He holds his head in his hands, realizing he's officially out of money. The waitress notices he's totally tuned out, while another regular laughs about the kid acting up again. Node doesn't even move from the table, looking like a total mess. Some guy nearby notices Elsa isn't around and thinks it's pretty rare to see Node alone, so he leans in and asks his buddy if he heard the news yet. Word around the bar is that Node's party finally split up for good. The guys start laughing, wondering if Elsa dumped him or if it was the other way around. Everyone has a different version of the story, and the gossip starts getting loud. Node hears every word, thinking to himself that these drunks are just saying whatever they want. He keeps his face hidden, but then one of the guys slides a drink over to him and tells him to cheer up. Node doesn't say a word, just staring at the mug, and he decides to just let them talk their trash. He takes a huge gulp of the ale, thinking that at least he got a free drink out of the deal. The guys at the bar are still going off about Node's business, with one guy telling his buddy the party's definitely over. His friend is surprised, asking if Node was the one who got dumped, but the other guy says it was actually the girl who got the boot. Node just sits there listening to them talk trash, thinking these drunks don't know anything, but then someone pats him on the head and tells him to cheer up, which finally gets a reaction out of him. He slams back the rest of his drink with a huge gulp and shouts that it's time for a change of pace. He's not going to just sit around anymore, so he heads straight for the guild's request board. Usually the good jobs get snatched up as soon as they're posted in the morning, leaving Node standing there alone. Someone nearby asks if he's finally feeling better, and Node just gives a half-hearted answer while he scans the leftovers on the board. The jobs that nobody wants usually sit there for days, until the guild either pulls them down or adds some extra cash to the reward to make it worth the trouble. And Node reaches for one of the papers, thinking about how annoying tasks like hunting ice spirits get those bonuses. He knows it's still only a couple more silver coins in the end, but he keeps looking anyway. He thinks about how 4 silver coins could normally cover a guy's living expenses for an entire year, but the amount he actually needs is just insane. He figures his mom probably doesn't even expect him to bring home the full 200 coins she asked for. He checks the bonus on the job in his hand and calls the guild stingy for only offering a small contribution boost, yet he knows he has to do something. He understands his parents are just worried about Hannah's marriage since she's already over 20, so he figures if he can at least make 50 coins to pay down the debt, the groom's family might take them seriously. But as he stares at the board, a doubt creeps in, making him wonder if a plan like that will even work out in the end. Node finishes up a few jobs over the last 2 weeks, including the travel time, And after counting his bonus, he ends up with about 5 silver coins, which sounds like a lot, but he knows it's not enough. Even with the good pay, hitting the amount he needs for Hannah's wedding by spring feels like a pipe dream, and looking at the numbers, the guy just stares into space. He knows it's basically impossible to do this by himself. He catches himself thinking about how much easier it would be if Elsa were still around. But then he wonders if even her help would really change the situation, since the Ferris family debt is just a different beast entirely. He walks through the quiet streets knowing that even high-ranking crystal or bronze adventurers would struggle to pay that off, leaving him seeing visions of Elsa smiling and reaching out to him, almost like she's telling him to keep going, which snaps him out of his funk. He tells himself he can't give up because his sister's happiness depends on him, and he's definitely not in a position to just quit now, so he starts thinking bigger. If crystal rank pay won't cut it, he knows iron rank quests are where the real money is. Those jobs pay dozens of silver coins at a time. But then reality hits him again because those monsters are way too dangerous for him, and his sword probably wouldn't even leave a scratch. Besides, the guild won't even let a low-rank guy like him touch those papers. But he looks at his hand and gets a crazy idea. He wonders if he should just skip the guild entirely and find a client who will hire him directly. Node reaches out toward the board, knowing that if he goes rogue like this, his life is in his own hands. The guild definitely doesn't back this kind of move, but the guy is stuck because he has no clue where to even find the high-level monsters he'd need to hunt. It hits him that when a job is 2 ranks above his own, he can't even wrap his head around how to start. And standing there in the quiet hall, he looks up and realizes he's actually staring at the silver rank bulletin board. He looks at his hand and thinks if iron rank stuff is already out of his league, the monsters the silver rank guys fight must be on a whole different level. So he checks out a random flyer for wyvern parts. The client is offering a crazy reward of 800 silver coins for just 1 head. Node can't help but let out a dry laugh because that kind of money feels like nothing but a dream to him right now. It's a known fact that even the best fighters who climb up to iron rank usually hit a ceiling. Most of them can never break through the wall to reach silver. Walking away, he thinks about how those guys are just in a different league since they can actually take down a dragon, even if a wyvern is the weakest of the bunch. He starts thinking back to the stories he's heard, like that one silver rank adventurer who actually made it into the kingdom's Iron Dragon Knights. To him, anyone who can handle those beasts is a total monster. But then he remembers someone telling his brother Albiro that the Knights were his big chance to finally make it big. Node thinks his dad is being way too hard on his brother by expecting him to join the elite Iron Dragon Knights. He knows parents always want the best for their kids, but this just feels like too much pressure. Especially since he realizes that if he actually pulls this off, he might finally get his hands on those 200 silver coins. It's a total long shot, but it's still a better bet than just grinding out basic jobs for the rest of his life. And he stands there alone for a second, just staring at the wall while he tries to wrap his head around the plan. Later on, he catches up with that old drunk at the tavern and buys him a drink. The guy is pretty surprised and tells him he's being way more generous than usual. But the drunk guy can't help but ask why he's throwing money around if he's supposed to be broke. Node just smiles and tells him it's because he actually ran into a wyvern on his last quest, and he explains that he's not just being nice. He really needs to learn the right way to handle those beasts if he's going to survive. The guy takes a huge swig from his barrel and says he gets it now. Meeting one of those things is a total disaster for anyone. He tells Node to listen close because those monsters aren't something to mess with. So Node sits down with his notebook and asks Elsa if she'll share some of her own battle stories with him. She acts like it's a bit of a hassle, but she's clearly happy to brag a little bit as Node asks the old guy to fill him in on what to expect in the snowy mountain. The veteran tells him he needs to be careful because the snow golems are starting to show up around this time of year. The old drunk asks how Node actually managed to get away when that wyvern attacked him. Node just looks at his drink and says it was honestly just luck. So he starts flipping through his notebook, looking over everything he wrote down about monster habits and their weak points. He's trying to find a way to stay alive and outsmart them, because he knows that understanding how these creatures act is the only way forward. It's all about using the knowledge and the experience that others have left behind, and as he shuts the book, he reminds himself that having the right info is the most powerful weapon he has. While the rest of the tavern is busy partying and shouting for more drinks, Node stays tucked away in a corner by himself. He eventually heads out to a quiet spot to clear his head and go over his notes one last time, making sure his plan is solid. He gets this really serious look on his face and says it's finally time to get to work. Then he heads out into the freezing mountains and starts scaling a massive ice wall. He's swinging his pickaxe hard into the side of the cliff, but the climb is way tougher than it looks. He almost slips and has to catch his breath, admitting to himself that he almost didn't make it, and the next thing we see is his hand poking out from a huge pile of snow after getting buried. Node finally finds a spot to stop and collapses against his gear, breathing heavy as the cold starts to set in. He's totally wiped out and realizes that even with all his winter gear, the air out here is just brutal. He decides he needs to boil some water to keep his temperature up. So he sets up a small stove, using magic stones for fuel since there isn't a single piece of wood in sight. He knows it's a bit of a waste, but it's the only way to melt the snow and get a warm meal going. He pulls out some rations while the wind whistles around his hood, then he dunks a piece of hard, dry bread into the pot to soften it up. As he takes a bite, he notices the jam inside is actually really sweet. It's exactly what he needed to finally feel some warmth coming back, and after finishing his drink, he looks out across the snowy ridge. He spots a monster huddling in the distance, just staying still in the frost. He admits he'd stay and watch it all day if he had the time, but he knows he has to keep moving. He packs his cup away and continues scaling the massive, frozen cliff as the snow falls. He hammers stakes into the ice, dangling over a huge drop. Node stands on the edge of the ridge, looking out at the massive range ahead. He points out that the cliff in the distance is his next stop, and starts the long process of hammering stakes into the frozen rock. He pulls himself up bit by bit, focused on making it to the top while the wind starts picking up, whipping snow all around his cloak. He leans forward to keep his balance on the narrow ledge and moves around giant boulders that make him look like a tiny speck. He grips his gear tight, looking completely determined. He tells himself that he's finally ready to go after that wyvern egg, and we see the monster itself sitting on a jagged peak. Wyverns build their nests way up in these dangerous spots because they know smaller predators can't reach their young there. Node knows there are other nests, but those are way too far or hidden in lands with monsters that are just on another level. Trying to hit those spots without knowing the area would be a total suicide mission, so he sticks to this cliff since he's been here for winter quests before and knows the terrain well. He scales the vertical ice wall until he finally reaches a massive opening in the side of the mountain. He heads into the icy cave, keeping his guard up as the wind howls behind him. Node finally makes it inside the massive cavern. It's a frozen maze of ice and rock. He hides behind a thick pillar of ice, watching the area with total focus. Everything is going according to plan so far, and he remembers the intel he gathered. Apparently, the monster leaves its nest once a day to hunt during this time, meaning his timing is actually perfect. He watches as the wyvern lets out a low growl and takes off. With the snow this deep, it's going to be gone for a while looking for food, so Node wastes no time and sprints toward the back of the cave. He knows he has to find that egg and get out fast while the coast is clear. But when he starts digging through the nesting material, he finds absolutely nothing. He checks one spot, then another, but the egg isn't where it's supposed to be, leaving him frantically tearing through the pile. He starts panicking a bit, wondering where the hell the monster could have hidden it, until he tells himself to move faster. Just as he's about to lose hope, a weird, shimmering light catches his eye from the corner of the nest. He leans in and realizes it's not an egg at all, but a sword buried in the debris. He's completely thrown off, wondering why a weapon would even be up here. And as he takes a step closer to get a better look, his foot lands on something that makes a loud, sharp cracking sound. Node winces as he touches something sticky in the dark, pulling his hand back. He looks at the gross mess on his gloves and realizes with a shock that he's literally standing in a pile of wyvern poop. Looking at the sword again, it hits him that the weapon probably belonged to some poor adventurer who ended up as the monster's lunch, and he realizes the entire back of the cave is just one giant bathroom. He knows he has to find that egg and disappear before things get worse. After searching through the filth, he finally spots a cluster of large, smooth shapes tucked away in a corner, and he reaches out for one of the eggs. He tells himself that having this is the key to everything he's been working for, but a massive crash echoes through the cavern, shaking the ground beneath him. He wonders if it's an avalanche starting outside, but then he hears something else and his heart sinks as he realizes the wyvern has returned to the nest way earlier than it was supposed to. Ice starts falling from the ceiling as the monster lands, leaving Node panicking and wondering how he's going to get out of this mess. The problem is there's only one way out of the cave, and the wyvern is standing right in the middle of it. Node looks at his options, thinking about standing his ground and fighting the beast, but he knows that's basically a suicide mission, so the thought of just giving up and dying right there crosses his mind. He can almost see his own skull ending up in the pile of bones, but he snaps out of it and rejects those dark thoughts. He knows he has to hide immediately or it's over, so he spots a gap in the rocks and makes a break for it just as the massive wyvern fully enters the cave. It moves with a heavy weight, its claws scraping against the stone floor as it lets out a low, rumbling growl and settles down right over its nest of eggs. It's guarding them closely, making Node realize that he's stuck. He holds his breath and wonders if his hiding spot is actually going to keep him safe from those sharp eyes, and he realizes the monster would never think to look for him in its own bathroom area. Plus, the disgusting smell is doing him a favor by masking his scent. He tells himself this is actually a lucky break. He decides to just stay put until the creature flies away again so he can grab an egg and run, but the wyvern is in no hurry. It curls up and falls fast asleep, leaving Node sitting there in the filth feeling incredibly bored as the minutes tick by. He's been waiting for a really long time now. He watches the eggs, noting that the monster hasn't moved even a little bit, and he's starting to wonder how much longer this is going to take. The smell is so bad that Node's nose is actually starting to go numb. He stays tucked behind the rocks, barely moving a muscle as the wyvern towers right over his hiding spot. He's completely frozen, just watching those huge scales pass by and hoping it hasn't spotted him yet. The ground shakes with a heavy thud, making him think the beast is coming straight for his throat, so he closes his eyes and starts praying. He says a quick goodbye to his parents and sisters, figured he's totally done for and can't believe his life is ending in a place like this. The monster keeps moving around right on top of him, but then he hears a weird sound that makes him snap his eyes open. He peeks out, wondering what the hell is going on, and he can't even find the words for what he's seeing. He just stares blankly at the scene while all the fear just drains out of him. He's stuck in a daze, watching the massive creature and realizing that the monster is actually just using the cave as its personal bathroom. It's gross, but he knows he's safe for now, and before he knows it, a massive amount of time has passed. He's been hiding there so long that he starts wondering if it's already been a full day. Node watches through the cracks in the rocks. The massive beast finally moves and takes off to go hunting. This is the moment he's been waiting for. Based on how fast those things fly, he figures he's got less than an hour to move, so he tells himself this is his one and only shot. He grabs one of the eggs, but it's way heavier than he expected. He's actually wondering if the thing is made of solid iron because he can barely lift it. He knows he has to move fast and get out of the cave before the mother comes back, but the second he steps outside, he gets hit by a wall of white. It's a full-on blizzard out there and he starts struggling immediately. The wind is trying to knock him over while he hauls the massive egg through the deep snow. His feet keep sinking and his legs are starting to give out. He wishes he knew if he could stop to catch his breath, but he has no idea how aggressive the wyvern will be once it realizes its egg is gone. He remembers asking Elsa about it back at the tavern, but she just finished another ale and told him she didn't know because she usually just kills the monsters before heading home. It turns out the advice from those high-rank adventurers is great for them, but Node realizes he's nowhere near their level yet. He's still way too close to the nest for comfort, and he knows if he doesn't put some distance between them soon, he's a dead man. Node's hands are shaking like crazy while he grips the heavy egg. He knows if he doesn't move now, he's dead. He tries to step forward but realizes his coat has frozen solid like a piece of wood, making it impossible to walk, and then it hits him. He remembers his dad and brother talking about how people in the north use boards to slide down mountains at high speeds, so he uses some hot water to melt and reshape his frozen coat, turning the stiff material into makeshift skis. He lines himself up and takes off down the slope, feeling the wind pick up as he successfully starts sliding, leaving him flying down the mountainside just as the wyvern returns to the nest and realizes its prize is gone. Later on, Node looks back at the peaks and thinks about how he never would have survived if he'd tried to walk down normally. He's finally safe in the back of a carriage, huddled up and catching his breath after the narrow escape, so he reaches out to the egg and tells it that it really put him through the ringer. He realizes all the months of planning were worth it. Selling this will pay off enough debt to let his sister Hannah finally get married. Node sits in the back of the carriage, looking down at the egg and thinking about how scary it is that even after all this, the interest on the family debt still isn't paid off. He's staring at the shell when he notices something weird and lets out a quiet sound because there's a huge crack spreading across the surface, making him completely freak out. He starts panicking, wondering where he could have bumped it and worrying that if the egg gets damaged or goes bad, the price will tank, and this thing was his family's last real hope. Node puts his face in his hands, totally crushed because he knows there's no way he can ever make it back to that nest to get another one, but he tries to keep it together, telling himself he needs to reinforce the shell since they're almost at the royal capital anyway. Just as he reaches for it, the shell completely gives way and shatters, leaving him yelling out in total disbelief. Inside the mess of broken shell, a tiny eye snaps open. Something is alive in there. Instead of a ruined egg, Node finds himself holding a tiny baby dragon that chirps and snuggles right into his chest, while he just stands there stunned, still thinking about the happy future he promised his sister Hannah. Node watches his family laughing together and thinks about how beautiful his sister Hannah looks when she's finally happy. But the moment is cut short as he starts panicking, barely able to get his words out because the little creature in his arms lets out a soft chirp, still wearing pieces of its shell like a tiny hat. It lets out another loud cry and starts nuzzling right into his chest, while Node just stands there in total silence, looking down at the baby dragon and wondering what he's supposed to do now. The little thing doesn't seem to care and just keeps rubbing its face against him. Just then, Node's father comes running out to greet him, shouting about how happy he is that his son is safe, so Node just tries to tell him he's back. His father stops mid-sentence when he noticed something moving under the cloak and asks what he's got hiding in there, leaving Node sweating as he tries to explain, only for the baby to pop its head out and shock both his father and Alec. The tiny wyvern just tilts its head and chirps at them from inside the folds of the cloth. Node just looks down at the little creature wrapped up in his arms, his face turning bright red as the reality of what happened starts to sink in. The baby wyvern lets out a tiny chirp, looking around the room while Node tries to explain to his stunned father and a very calm Alec that this is just the situation they're in now. Before Node can say another word, his father suddenly turns around and bolts out the door, yelling for Node to stay home while he goes to settle things, leaving Node to slump onto the couch in total stress. As he sits there, he starts remembering what he knows about these creatures, specifically how the Iron Dragon Knights only use dragons hatched from eggs because wild ones are way too violent to ever train. He looks down at the little guy nuzzling his arm and thinks about how he's always heard they're supposed to be super aggressive, but this one is being incredibly calm, and he wonders if it's just a baby thing. Suddenly, the door swings open, and a voice from the hallway mentions how the rumors about the dragon being attached to him seem to be true, making Node jump out of his skin. Node's father walks back in with two serious-looking men, introducing one of them as the vice commander of the Iron Dragon Knights, which sends Node into a total state of shock. The little wyvern seems to feel the intense vibe in the room, letting out a weak chirp while it starts shaking with nerves. It starts crying out even louder, so Node panics and tries to shush the baby, telling it that it needs to stay quiet while the important guests are watching. The vice commander just laughs the whole thing off, telling them it's fine and apologizing for barging in while they're still messy from their travels, since that's just how the adventure life works. The vice commander looks at the baby dragon and asks Node if it's his, noting that the little guy seems really attached to him, and right then Node nervously says yes, but tries to play it down by saying it might just be because he still smells like the mother dragon from the nest, though the vice commander seems pretty impressed by the whole thing. Just then, Alec cuts in to announce he's back, and he sets down a tray full of raw steaks. Node looks at the food, a bit surprised that they're just giving it straight meat already, so the vice commander tells him to go ahead and feed it. Alec hands the tray over to Node, who agrees to give it a try while the little wyvern leans in and gives the meat a long sniff. It looks pretty interested in the meal, and then it suddenly opens its mouth wide and takes a huge bite. The creature doesn't hesitate for a second, and Node can't believe how much the little guy is eating. He mentions that it has a crazy appetite and asks if it's already looking for seconds, which prompts the vice commander to reach out with another piece. He offers it to the baby himself, and the wyvern goes absolutely wild on the food. It starts ripping into the meat with a lot more energy than anyone expected. Vice Commander Goldwyn and Walter watch the baby dragon, noting it looks exactly like a normal wyvern, but Walter points out that the way it acts is totally different from anything they've seen before, and the vice commander suddenly says Node's full name out loud. Node stands there looking completely confused while the little dragon chirps happily in his arms. Then Goldwyn doesn't waste any time and shouts that he's officially appointing Node as an apprentice for the Iron Dragon Knights. Node is so shocked his brain just about stops working, and he can only manage a confused stutter, which prompts Goldwyn to turn to Walter and tell him he's the one in charge of looking after the kid from now on. He wants Walter to keep a close eye on him, but Walter looks pretty annoyed by the whole idea. He repeats the order back like he can't believe he's stuck babysitting a random kid, especially because he tells the vice commander straight up that he doesn't think Node has what it takes to be one of them. He looks at Node and just doesn't see the skills an Iron Dragon Knight needs, so he suggests that they should at least wait for the kid to graduate from the military academy first. He's clearly trying to get out of the job. However, Goldwyn explains that they'd lose all their best data if they waited that long. He says the hatchling only likes Node because he's covered in the mother's scent, while Node just stands there blushing, thinking he really needs to stop diving into dragon nests, since Goldwyn mentions that the whole thing is actually pretty simple when you think about it, even though nobody had the guts to actually try it before. It's a total game changer, and he tells Walter they should just treat this as a lucky break. He's convinced that having Node and the dragon around is going to be a massive win for the Iron Dragon Knights in the long run. Everyone starts ganging up on Walter, the vice commander, and even Node's father, Albert, are both practically begging him to just take the job, and Walter is clearly feeling the pressure. Rubbing his eyes and letting out a massive sigh, he can't believe he's getting talked into this by these guys, but he finally snaps and says he'll do it, which makes Albert look pretty happy, while someone else shows up with more food to keep the party going. Node is just standing there in total silence, sweating bullets, He's honestly wondering how his simple life as an adventurer turned into this crazy mess. Walter turns his full attention to the kid, using his full name to show he's serious. He says he won't show a single bit of mercy until Node is a real dragon knight. And Node is so freaked out that he just shouts back a yes sir without even thinking. Inside his head though, he's completely losing it and has no idea what he just signed up for. His brain is pretty much short-circuiting at this point. He just can't process how fast everything is moving. Later on, the group is at a wedding ceremony when the little dragon suddenly decides it's the perfect time to start making a scene. The baby dragon is chirping like crazy in Node's arms, and Node just looks down at it, asking if the little guy is really already awake and ready to go, which actually ends up annoying the guy trying to read a speech. He tells them to shut it and show some respect while he's talking. The guests are already gossiping about Node. An older noble points him out as the third fairest son, mentioning he heard the kid actually made it into the Iron Dragon Knights. Node tries to keep his cool and tells himself to pull it together. The baby dragon isn't helping much though, just chirping away while his little sister Iris ignores the drama to focus on the buffet. She's busy grabbing snacks while the dragon keeps making noise. The little dragon opens its mouth wide for a bite, and Node just watches wondering if this thing is ever going to stop being hungry. The ceremony itself is pretty nice. The bride and groom look happy standing there at the altar together. It's a big moment for the family. Node's mother is even getting choked up and dabbing her eyes while everyone watches. Looking back at the broken shell, the whole plan to sell that egg to the knights for a quick fortune ended up being a total bust. But it wasn't all bad even as an apprentice. Just being part of the kingdom's top knight order was enough to make the groom's family actually respect him. But then the party ends and things get real. Node is suddenly back to reality and gasping for air as Walter starts breathing down his neck. He's completely exhausted and feeling sick, but Walter just yells at him to keep moving and adds another 100 rounds of training to his plate. Node is running for his life and can't believe this is actually happening. He's completely wiped out while the baby dragon flies right behind him. He looks back and calls out to the little guy, but the dragon just chirps and dives straight for him like it's playtime. The dragon lands hard right on top of his head. It's a lot heavier than it looks, and Node nearly faceplants from the impact. Node yells at the dragon to get off because it's crushing him, but the creature just makes happy noises. He realizes his new life is going to be a total handful. Suddenly the scene shifts to a dark forest where Node is running around, completely lost, and wondering what he even got himself into. Something slams into the ground right in front of him with a loud thud. He stops dead in his tracks. He looks up and sees a massive wyvern looming over him. His blood runs cold as he tells himself he needs to get out of there fast. The monster opens its huge mouth and lets out a roar that shakes everything. Node just starts screaming as loud as he can. His vision goes white and he keeps shouting while reaching out for anything to grab onto. He snaps awake in his own bed, gasping for air. He's still out of it, but then he notices something heavy sitting right on his chest under the covers. The baby dragon is out cold, snoring and drooling right on top of Node's head. Node finally wakes up feeling like a wreck, wondering if that crazy nightmare he just had was actually caused by this little guy's weight. He sits up and shouts the name Newt at the top of his lungs, but the dragon doesn't seem to care at all, just chirping back with a huge, happy look on its face. Node just sits there in bed looking totally exhausted and annoyed while Newt acts like everything is great, leaving the little dragon to suddenly shift moods, looking up at him with these big, sad eyes and letting out a tiny whimper. Node can't even stay mad, telling the dragon he's really something else, while Newt just lets out another long, happy chirp. Moving on, the story shifts to the Iron Dragon Knight's home base, which is tucked away deep in the mountain. It's a rough, inconvenient place that looks exactly like where a wyvern would nest, so bad that no other knight groups even try to claim the land. But that's actually why it works, since it makes it super easy to catch any spies trying to sneak toward the capital. Node is walking along and starts yelling at his cloak because Newt is wiggling around inside, trying to poke his head out. He warns the little dragon that it's going to be a disaster if anyone spots him, telling him to just stay quiet until they hit the camp, while the girl nearby watches them with a totally confused look. The story moves to the training grounds, a massive area carved right into the mountainside where they raise adult wyverns, and where the kingdom's top knights spend every day getting stronger, and Node is right there with them, face down in the dirt and panting like crazy, while a voice from above asks if he's already finished and can't even stand up. Instructor Aaron stands over him, saying Node is clearly behind because he never went to the military academy, and that even with his special circumstances, he has to prove he actually belongs in the best knight squad in the land. Node doesn't quit though, forcing himself back onto his feet and telling the instructor that he can still keep going. They clash again immediately. Arons brings down a huge swing that looks like it's going to crush him, but Node managed to get his sword up just in time. The weight is almost too much to handle, and Node can feel his arms shaking as he tries to hold his ground. It feels less like a sword and more like he's being hit with a giant sledgehammer. But he manages to stay standing. He thinks he sees a chance and shouts that he's got him. But Arons is way too fast, jumping right over Node's head and landing behind him before he can even react. Node is flat on his back and completely out of breath. His body is covered in dirt while a sword stays pointed right at his throat. Instructor Arons doesn't give him a second to breathe, yelling as he raises his blade high for one last strike while Node looks up, totally spent and unable to move. Node's eyes go wide as he realizes he's trapped. There's no room to move and he knows for a fact he can't dodge this hit. So he just braces himself as the wooden training sword slams right into his chest plate with a heavy thud. The instructor finally calls it, telling Node that's enough for today before turning to walk away, leaving Node lying spread-eagle in the dirt, too tired to even speak. He eventually tries to push himself up, but his arms are shaking. He's stuck thinking about how he couldn't even land a single hit or hold his own for a second. As he watches the instructor walk off, he notices the guy isn't even sweating. It hits him right then just how huge the gap is between a regular guy and a top-tier knight. He's sitting there feeling pretty defeated when someone suddenly yells out, jokingly saying that it looks like he got his head handed to him again today. A knight with a big grin and a spear slung over his shoulder walks up. Node looks up from the ground and tiredly greets the guy as his senior. The guy tells Node he should just call him Rena instead of being so formal, then hands him a rake and tells him to get started on leveling the messy training ground. Node gets to work smoothing out the dirt with a rake, but he stops for a second to ask Rena what he's actually doing there. Rena explains that the instructor was looking for him. Apparently Newt's medical checkup is all finished, and Node needs to go pick him up. Before walking off, Rena mentions that the little dragon seems to want something from him. Node's a bit confused by that, but Rena just waves and tells him to hurry it along. Node makes his way over to the research wing, which is this big, imposing stone building on the edge of the grounds. He bursts through the doors looking completely out of breath, immediately shouting out an apology for taking so long to get there. But before he can even stand up straight, Newt flies right at his face with a happy chirp, catching Node totally off guard. The little dragon starts nuzzling and rubbing his head against Node's hair, Node struggling to pull him off, telling the clingy guy to give him some space already. A woman in a lab coat holding a clipboard just stands there laughing at them. She says it's pretty obvious that Newt was dying to see him again. Node tries to talk to the professor, while Newt is basically glued to his head. The dragon just keeps chirping and digging his claws in while Node tells him to let go. He finally manages to peel the little guy off and holds him up with both hands. Newt just stares back with these big, innocent eyes like he didn't do anything wrong. Newt keeps chirping and clinging to Node's head like glue, while Node just tries to peel the little guy off and tells him to cut it out. The professor watches them play around with a look that's half amused and half curious, leading her to sit back down at her desk to keep writing. She mentions how this little dragon is actually pretty interesting, making Node ask what she means by that. She continues writing her report, explaining that while the dragon is physically the same as any other wyvern, his behavior is what's really weird. And it turns out that none of the other wyverns they've hatched have ever been this friendly. Usually they're just aggressive and stay on guard around the staff or the knights. Node just stands there holding the happy dragon, looking a bit awkward as the professor says she can't believe Newt actually thinks a human smells like his mother. She keeps scribbling away, wondering out loud if this is something they just somehow missed in their research before. And she figures that since wyverns are such simple creatures, they can get really attached once they trust someone. So Node finally speaks up and asks what she actually needs him to do. The professor turns around with a massive, excited smile and tells him she wants to introduce Newt to all the other wyverns right now. She starts heading for the door, telling him to keep up, while Node follows behind looking pretty nervous and asks if he really has to be there for this. As they walk through the massive stone hallway, she explains that she's dying to see how the rest of the dragons react to a human that one of their own has totally accepted. They finally reach the heavy iron gates of the restricted area, where the sound of metal rattling fills the air as Node senses a dragon nearby. The professor walks right up to the gate like she owns the place, telling the guards she's just passing through, but the guys on duty look totally stressed out and tell her she can't just wander in. One of the guards is basically having a meltdown over her casual attitude, but the professor just smiles and asks what the big deal is since they're only there to meet a dragon, which only makes the guards more confused as they spot Node hanging out in the back and ask who the kid is. Node just stands there feeling pretty awkward while holding onto Newt, so the guard eventually gives up with a miserable look on his face, agreeing to let them in as long as he comes along to keep an eye on things. The professor is thrilled, but the guard pulls Node aside with a completely dead serious expression, begging him to make sure he doesn't do a single thing to provoke the dragon. As they head down into the dark stone corridor, Node realizes that basically everyone at this facility just ends up getting dragged along by the professor's whims. And looking around the massive, chilly hallway, he can't help but think about how much this place feels like the actual wyvern nest where he first found Newt's egg. The professor suddenly stops and says they've reached the spot, which catches Node off guard since he didn't think they'd get there that fast. But he quickly realizes this isn't a cave but a massive indoor stable for the beasts, right before a deafening roar echoes through the entire chamber. The massive roar vibrates through Node's entire chest as he stands frozen in the dark, and looking up, he finds himself staring straight into the giant mouth of a dragon, certain that his life is about to end right then and there. But suddenly, a guy yells at the beast to shut up and lands a solid punch right across the dragon's nose, making the massive creature back off while the guy just casually hops onto its back, leaving Node standing there completely lost and wondering what he just saw. The guy keeps complaining about how noisy the dragon is being, but then he stops and notices the professor and the guard standing nearby, and recognizing her immediately, he asks if she's there on business and why exactly Node is tagging along with her. The professor just gives a cheerful smile and starts explaining her plan, telling him that she figured it would be a good idea to let Newt meet some of the older dragons and see how they interact. The guy thinks that sounds like a blast and asks if he can stick around to watch, and the professor is more than happy to let him join. Moving on, the professor starts giving the dragon, Zephyr, a good rubdown while complimenting how healthy its scales look today. Rena keeps bragging about how cool the dragon's scales are, and looking at them, Node can't believe how chill the massive beast is while being petted, especially since Walter shows up with a torch and asks if Rena is slacking off in the stables again. Node and Newt jump because they weren't expecting him, and Node can't help but think that slacking off in a dragon's nest is a pretty crazy move. Turns out, this guy's full name is actually Reynald Harlow, but he just tells Node to call him Rena while acting all friendly. Walter explains that even though the guy acts like a total clown most of the time, he's actually one of the top-tier fighters in the entire Night Order, which really puts things into perspective for Node as he looks at the massive dragon. He realizes he has a ton of stuff to learn if he wants to keep up, but Rena just grins and says he feels like he's learning something new every single day himself. Node looks down at his new uniform and grips the fabric, feeling like he's still way too inexperienced to be wearing the robe of the Iron Dragon Knights, but Newt doesn't seem to care about any of that, happily licking Node's face as he holds the little guy close. The little dragon just stares up at him with these big, sparkling eyes, acting like Node is the only person in the world. And Node just smiles and tells himself that it's okay. He knows he's still a rookie with a long way to go, just like the little creature in his arms. Node looks at Newt with a small smile, telling himself that he just needs to get stronger at his own pace. He realizes he has to take things one step at a time without rushing, and thanks the little guy for being there. Newt just chirps back with a curious sound, looking up at him while Rena waves from across the training grounds and yells for Node to come over for some introductions. Node shouts back that he's on his way, hurrying over until Rena introduces him to the massive beast standing there. He explains the dragon's name is Zephyros, though everyone just calls him Zephyr for short. Turns out Rena took over the dragon from a retiring senior when he first joined the Knights. He mentions that Zephyr is a seasoned veteran and is already 15 years old, but then Rena leans in close and warns Node not to show any fear. He explains that these dragons are incredibly smart and will actually attack if they sense someone is scared of them. Node can feel the giant creature watching his every move. He starts to sweat and asks what he's supposed to do to keep the peace, so Rena tells him it's all about having guts. He points toward Newt, who is currently staring down the massive dragon without showing a single bit of fear. Rena notes that even though the baby wouldn't stand a chance in a fight, he isn't intimidated by Zephyr at all. He tells Node he should really try to learn from the little guy's mindset, leading Node to take a deep breath and tell himself to stay calm. He asks Rena if it's okay to reach out and touch the dragon, which gets Rena pretty fired up about his new student's courage. Node stands right in front of the massive dragon while Rena and the professor watch from the side, but as he gets closer, he notices how cold it feels. He says that even though Newt is chilly, Zephyr feels like a total block of ice. It turns out dragons have such tough bodies they can live anywhere from frozen mountains to active volcanoes without much trouble. So Rena proudly points out that Zephyr is a rare snow dragon variant. He thinks it looks awesome, though the professor says it's actually kind of a shame. Since variants are way stronger than normal dragons, Node starts wondering if Rena might actually be more powerful than a gold rank adventurer. But Rena tells him to quit overthinking and just introduce the two dragons. Node agrees and holds the baby up, hoping everything goes smoothly as the giant beast stares down at the little guy. Node asks if this is really the right way to do things, just as Zephyr leans his massive head down to get a good sniff of the baby. Node notices the dragon is really checking out Newt's scent, and Rena thinks it's a pretty interesting reaction to watch. until the big dragon suddenly turns its focus toward Node. He gets totally freaked out, asking if he's the one getting sniffed next. Node stands right behind the massive dragon, realizing it's definitely not acting hostile, though he still isn't quite sure what's going on as the big guy seems to actually accept Newt, who starts happily rubbing against his fur. Rena just watches from the side and gives a thoughtful hum while half a year flies by in what feels like a blink. Node ends up asking his instructor if he's really getting a vacation after all this time, since the instructor has to break the news that things are about to get crazy. He explains the Iron Dragon Knights are being sent off for big joint drills and border duty, so Node puts it together and realizes that nobody is going to have the time to look after a rookie like him for a while. His instructor tells him it's not like he's getting a real vacation, but he's got 2 months off. He asks Node what he's even going to do with that time until Newt suddenly lunges forward in the woods. The little dragon dives right for a monster's throat and takes it down in a spray of blood. Node walks over and tells Newt he did a solid job, mentioning that these monsters aren't even a challenge for him anymore. Newt just chirps back, especially since they just took out a spear deer, which is a monster usually meant for much higher-ranked adventurers. These things are known for being crazy territorial and having horns that can rip right through armor, but Node just checks his paperwork and says that officially finishes up the quest for the monsters that were wrecking the local fields. Node watches as Newt snags a piece of meat midair, mentioning that even with a bit of help, the little guy is getting pretty good at hunting on his own. He takes a seat against a massive rock to rest for a bit, just watching Newt happily tear into his meal on the forest floor. It's pretty obvious that Newt is growing fast, and Node can't help but notice his body has gotten a lot bigger lately. Thinking back to his instructor asking what he's going to do with his 2 months of leave, Node grips his blade and decides he's going to head back to the guild as an adventurer to keep his skills sharp, determined to get even stronger during his time off. Newt chirps for more food, so Node gives him another helping while the little dragon makes a happy sound, and then Node eventually makes his way back to town. Walking through the busy halls of the guild feels nostalgic, bringing back a lot of old memories as he stands in front of the quest board. He's left Newt back at the family home to keep Iris company, so he's focused on finding a job that'll push him. He spots a request that looks like a perfect fit, a high-rank hunt for monsters called land sharks out in Alco's territory, since these things are a real pain to deal with. They hide under the ground and blend in with the dirt, waiting to jump anyone who walks by. Land sharks are known for traveling in massive packs. But the good news is that they aren't actually that strong on their own, so Node looks over the board and realizes that since it's already late in the day, the only jobs left are the annoying ones that don't pay well. He figures fighting land sharks would be perfect training for Newt without being too dangerous, so he decides this quest is actually a pretty safe bet. As long as he doesn't lose money, he's cool with it, and he realizes he finally has the breathing room to think this way, making him feel like all his past risks were worth it. But then he notices something weird on the paper and wonders what's going on, seeing that the request for 20 monsters came all the way from Wesina City. He's confused because the hunt is supposed to happen in Alco's territory, which makes him wonder why someone from the city next door is the one asking for help. Normally, it's the local lord's job to clear out monsters, but since most of the soldiers are just farmers who need to work the land, the higher-ups usually just bite the bullet and pay the Adventurers Guild to handle the dirty work whenever things get too messy. Node keeps thinking it over, knowing the name on the paper should be a village chief or the lord, and he can't figure out why an outsider is involved, until a hand suddenly drops onto his shoulder. A voice from behind tells him he's better off just walking away from this one. Zinnius greets Node with a casual yo, catching him off guard while Lysis waves and says it's been a long time since they last saw him. Zinnius asks if Node knows the deal with this request, and as Node realizes which one he means, Zinnius explains it's the cleanup from a monster stampede. A stampede is basically when monsters breed way too fast and swarm the surrounding area looking for food and a place to live. It happens with all sorts of group-type creatures like bugs or birds, and even includes things as bad as locust plagues, which is why the monsters start traveling huge distances and eat everything they find, leaving the entire region in total ruin. Zinnius looks pretty serious as he mentions that his party was actually part of the group sent in to stop the disaster. He remembers it all started back when they were just finishing up a basic gathering quest and heading home, spending their time handing out packages and helping the locals with deliveries, just trying to be useful. They waved goodbye to the villagers after finishing their rounds, thinking it was just another normal day on the job. Zinnius notes that was the last of the chores for that village, while Lysis says you just have to take things one small step at a time. Zinnius notes that even though they aren't on Node's level yet, they still have to make a living as adventurers. Lysis looks off into the distance, wondering how Node is doing these days and mentions she heard you can find some legendary mushrooms growing around this area. Zinnias catches on and asks if that means it's finally time for Shino to show off her cooking skills, but he reminds everyone they really need to get back to the royal capital as soon as possible. Suddenly, Jago stops dead in his tracks with a look of pure dread. Zinnias notices and asks him what's wrong when the ground starts shaking, and a massive impact hits right next to them. Someone in the party asks if they just felt something, but they don't have to wait long for an answer because Zinnias draws his sword in a panic, screaming out that they're being surrounded by a massive swarm of land sharks. He realizes too late they've accidentally walked right into the middle of a nest, leaving Shino completely frozen in shock as she says it can't be real. The monsters burst out of the ground from every direction, forcing Zinnias and Jagos to desperately hack away just to keep the jaws back. Shino screams that they're going to get wiped out if they stay here, especially with the group struggling to hold the line, while Zinnias makes the call for everyone to just give up on the fight and run straight for Wesina City to save their lives. Later on, Zinnias sits there clutching his head in total defeat, realizing that in the chaos, they lost every single bit of the cargo they were supposed to deliver. The streets of Wesina City are usually a huge trade hub, but right now everyone is losing it, demanding to know what the local lord and the guild are even doing to help. Casualties are piling up everywhere, with adventurers screaming in pain while people yell for healers to get treatment ready as fast as they can. Down at the guild, everyone is crowded around the notice board. They can't believe there's actually an emergency quest posted for a full-blown land shark disaster. Zinnias explains that with the city in a total panic, his group didn't have much of a choice and joined the emergency hunt to try and stop the swarm. But it turned into a nightmare since no matter how many sharks they cut down, more just kept coming until the healers were too exhausted to keep up. During the chaos, a shark lunges straight for Almina. Zinnias screams her name as the monster closes in on her while she's trapped on the ground. Back in the present, Zinnias asks if Shino actually made it out of that mess okay, but Lysis just looks down and says she took a really bad hit. Zinnias points to his own hip to show exactly where she got wounded, which looks a little bit awkward since Lysis turns bright red and looks completely mortified, asking him if he's seriously talking about her butt in front of everyone. Zinnias finishes the story by saying Lysis fixed her up, but they had to retire from the fight. Luckily, a silver rank guy showed up and killed the boss to end the whole disaster, and Node just nods along. Node thinks back to the armored wolf leader he and Elsa fought. He realizes that normal mountain wolves have the potential to grow into those massive threats. Looking at the paper, he asks how this even connects to the current job since they already took the leader down, but Zinnias explains that the whole monster disaster actually started over in the Alco's territory, which catches Node off guard. Apparently, the current lord there is obsessed with money. He dumped all his duties on his staff and kicked out anyone who got on his bad side. Because of the insane taxes, the land went to ruin and turned into a total breeding ground for monsters. And hearing about how the lord handled things makes Elsa look completely disgusted. She calls the guy the absolute worst. Zinnias realizes his friends joined the fight because they grew up in a small village. They probably saw Alcos and panicked that their own home would be next. He mentions that the Alcos territory doesn't even have the power to clean up the remaining monsters, so the city of Wesina is paying for the request themselves. It's a mess, and Zinnias thinks the whole territory might actually get seized by the king soon, leaving Node heading out while thinking that these complicated political jobs are a nightmare. A trainee dragon knight getting involved would only make things way more confusing. Node hands the paperwork back and thanks Zinnias for the heads up. He decides to pass on the Alco's job since it sounds like a political nightmare. Since that job is out, Zinnias asks what they want to do next. He thinks it might be better to just wait for the board to refresh in the morning. Node agrees that sounds like a plan, but right then the guild receptionist walks over. She asks Node if he has a second to talk. She drops some big news, telling Node that a nomination request just came in specifically for him. Normally, these requests only go to the big-name adventurers or specialists because the client is asking for one person by name, and taking these jobs is the best way to make high-level connections. It usually leads to some pretty sweet perks. Working with the Merchant Guild means getting first dibs on rare gear, while the alchemists give priority on powerful magic meds. But that's only if things go well. The receptionist hands over the request and a letter, leaving Node standing there completely shocked. He doesn't know anyone famous enough to send him a private job. He starts worrying that someone might be trying to set him up, so he asks the receptionist who actually sent the thing. She looks at the files and tells him the client's name is Johan de Aubriere. Turns out it's Node's own brother who married into another noble house. Node stands there completely frozen. He can't believe his brother Johan is the one who sent the request. He double-checks the envelope to make sure it's real, reading the letter inside where Johan calls him his dear brother and starts breaking down what the job is actually about. Johan is sitting comfortably in his office while he writes about how some monsters have been acting up in his territory. He says since they haven't caught up in forever, Node should swing by and clear them out for a low price. The receptionist looks a bit worried and asks if he's sure about this since the pay is honestly terrible. But Node tells her it's fine and he's taking the job anyway. It makes sense because after Johan married into the Aubriere family, they've been the ones keeping the Ferris household afloat with money for years. Node tells Zinnius and Lysis that there's no way he could say no to his brother. Even if the reward is basically pocket change, he's set on going. The only thing he's actually worried about is how he's going to handle a week-long carriage ride with Newt along for the ride. Luckily, the Iron Dragon Knights offer him one of their own carriages to use, and Node thanks them for making things so much easier. The horses snort at Newt while the little dragon just tries to play. Node is stuck in the driver's seat of the carriage looking totally drained. The long trip is clearly wearing him down, and he eventually starts nodding off as the horses keep a steady pace down the path. Suddenly, Newt pokes his head out and lets out a massive screech right behind him. It scares the life out of Node, who jumps and screams while trying to keep his grip on the reins. The horses freak out and start to bolt, forcing Node to lean all the way back and pull the reins with everything he's got to get them to settle down. He looks back at Newt and asks if he's already bored of being cooped up in the back. The dragon just gives him this restless look like he's ready to cause more trouble. Newt just chirps happily like he didn't do anything wrong, which gets a scolding from Node who tells him he needs to actually behave for once. Newt makes a satisfied little sound and closes his eyes, looking way too proud of the mess he just made. Node sits there in silence for a minute to calm his nerves before telling Newt that once they start running into more people, he's going to have to hide back inside. The carriage keeps rolling along the quiet road while Node just hopes that if anyone does catch a glimpse of the dragon, they'll just think it's a cat or something. A few days go by and Node is back to lounging in the seat. He looks up just in time to see Newt finally lose his patience and take off into the sky. He realizes Newt is completely done with the carriage life. He figures since the little guy is flying so high up, nobody is even going to notice a dragon circling above them anyway. Node rides along on his horse while an older guy in a thick coat sits nearby, and they keep a steady pace as night falls over the massive fortress sitting up on the hill. The crescent moon is out as the carriage finally pulls up to the entrance. Johan is there waiting with a smile and tells Node he's glad he made the long trip, but then he looks down at the dragon and asks if it hasn't gotten way bigger since the last time they spoke. Node says yeah and mentions that Iris named him Newt. Little Emilia starts yelling that it's not named after a gecko, but a legendary warrior, making Node admit he already got yelled at for getting that wrong. One of the girls catches a good look at Newt and just loses it, screaming about how he's the cutest thing she's ever seen. The woman behind her has to grab her and tell her to chill out since she hasn't even said hello yet, so she apologizes to Node for the kid being so hyper. Node just laughs it off and says hi to Emilia, thinking she's probably the same age as his sister Iris, as the two of them stand there completely obsessed with the little dragon. They've got sparkles in their eyes and can't look away, so Node gives Newt a little nudge and tells him to say hi, and the dragon just lets out a happy chirp for everyone. Emilia introduces herself and says she wants them to be friends, and while everyone gets settled in, Johan mentions they probably both have a lot to catch up on, but suggests they start things off with a welcome meal so the staff brings out the food, apologizing for it being a simple spread. Node quickly tells them it's totally fine and that everything looks delicious while the dinner gets underway. For nobles, the dinner table is usually where all the big meetings and political moves happen, sometimes even becoming a spot for secret schemes. Since Node is family, one of the older relatives brings up the topic of marriage, asking him if he's starting to think about that yet as Node breaks off a piece of bread and replies that marriage feels like a long way off since he's still just a trainee. The old guy is surprised and asks if he really means he's training with the Iron Dragon Knights, so Node humbly explains he's just at the bottom of the ladder, but the man says his father must be bragging to everyone about him. Node just stays modest and says he's still got a lot to learn. The older noble laughs and says it's not every day they get to talk to someone with ties to the knights, and hearing the real stories from the inside is always the best part of these get-togethers. He explains that for people living out in the provinces, the only time they ever get to see the knights in action is during joint drills, which reminds someone else at the table that the Eastern Knights are planning a massive drill soon. They start wondering just how long it's been since the last time they saw an exercise that big. Johan asks if all that happened back when Node was still just a little kid, wondering if the situation was really as big as they say. One of the older nobles at the table explains that while everyone was busy celebrating their victory in the war, the kingdom's territory grew so fast that it actually became a problem because it's hard for younger guys to really grasp the scale of it. He mentions that the border used to be right along the eastern mountains, which meant this whole region was constantly on the edge of getting dragged into the middle of the fighting. And even though they don't have to worry about being a war zone anymore, things haven't exactly been easy. Being part of the Royal Knights means they have to send out way more soldiers than before, which has completely drained the local workforce and left the farm work at a total standstill. Johan looks down and thinks to himself that this might actually be the perfect time to bring things up. Node catches his expression and looks over, asking his brother what he's thinking about as Johan reveals that the real reason he asked Node to come visit is actually tied into those upcoming military drills. Node looks pretty caught off guard and reminds him that he thought he was only there for a monster hunting job. But Johan just tells him that's technically true while leaning in, looking a bit more serious about the whole thing. He explains that some woodcutters recently found monster tracks in the forest, and when the guild sent some adventurers in to check it out, they found a massive spider nest hidden in the woods. The guild tried to get those adventurers to take care of it, but they completely backed out, claiming the job was way too dangerous for them. The problem is that all the high-ranked adventurers who could actually handle it are currently away on an expedition to the east and won't be back for a while, meaning the timing couldn't be worse since the massive drills have already taken all the men. With everyone gone, the local militia is basically non-existent and can't do anything to help, leaving the villages filled with nothing but women, children, and the elderly who can't fight off monsters on their own. Johan sets his fork down and admits he's also worried that bandits might see how defenseless they are and start moving in to cause even more trouble. Johan explains how some people manage to turn a profit by selling food during the chaos, and he points out that his brother-in-law is actually a really sharp businessman for pulling it off. He goes on to say that big military expeditions are basically huge business opportunities because of all the people moving around, but he mentions that the summer wheat harvest isn't looking great, and explains that since every decent adventurer headed east to chase the money, the only people left around here are rookies. Hiring a guild from out of town is way too expensive with all the fees, so he figured he'd just try sending a request directly to Node instead. Node looks pretty stressed out by the news and asks Johan what his plan was supposed to be if he hadn't decided to take a vacation and visit right now. Johan just shrugs it off and says he would have just introduced another adventurer he knows, figuring his brothers would at least consider the job for him, which makes the girls in the back look a little uneasy. He stops for a second and adds that there's actually another reason for all this, mentioning it's also for the sake of a new family member who's about to join them soon. Node looks a bit tired as Johan tells him not to even worry about the reward since his house is footing the bill, but his wife jumps in to say that's not what she was talking about. With a big smile, Johan finally reveals the big news that they have a baby on the way, and his wife happily adds that the new arrival is expected sometime this winter. Node is totally caught off guard by the news and immediately shouts out his congratulations to the both of them. But then the mood shifts as Johan brings the conversation back to the task at hand, asking about the specific monster target they need to hunt down in the forest. The target is finally revealed to be a massive creature known as a night spider, which is lurking deep inside the forest of Alba. The guide tells Node to follow him, leading the way while Node checks his monster book to get the details on this night spider thing. Newt flies overhead as the guide explains that these spiders are large, super aggressive carnivores. They spit out this sticky silk to build massive webs and have a really tough shell that makes them a nightmare to fight alone. Moving on, the guy mentions it's been a few weeks since the Lord banned anyone from coming into the woods. The local hunters are starting to get pretty annoyed about it. He explains that they never really had issues with strong monsters showing up here in the past, so Node asks him what kind of stuff they usually find or hunt around these parts. The guide says it's mostly just goblins, big bats, and spear deer, though they haven't seen any forest wolves lately. Node wonders if it's only weak monsters in the deep forest too, but the guy says they don't really go in that far. The guide mentions that herb bears sometimes wander out to the edge of the woods, while Newt keeps his nose to the wind and Node figures the night spider isn't actually from this part of the forest. It probably just got kicked out of its old territory, so the guide stops in his tracks and tells Node that this is as far as he's going to go. Node gives the guy a quick thanks for the help as they part ways, finally heading into the thick of the deep forest alone with Newt scouting from above. Node tells the little dragon they need to stay focused now, and Newt chirps back like he totally understands, then suddenly dives out of the sky with a loud cry, catching a wild boar monster completely off guard. Node gives him some pets and tells him he did a solid job. Newt just leans in, looking pretty proud of himself. He thinks about how crazy a wyvern's sense of smell is, and how Newt's scouting has made this whole trip go perfectly so far. As the sun starts to dip below the trees, Node decides to call it a day and start setting up a spot to camp. Node gets busy gathering a big pile of firewood while Newt helps out by scouting under the low branches, and he starts placing rocks around the pit, explaining that monsters aren't like regular animals. They aren't afraid of fire at all. He says they have to hide the light because a bright flame might attract something aggressive, so he keeps the fire small and contained, with a pot of soup bubbling away and skewers of meat cooking on the side. Newt sits there watching the food with his eyes wide, and his stomach lets out a loud growl that echoes through the quiet campsite. Node finally holds up one of the skewers and says the meat is ready, making Newt look like he's just seen a miracle. Then the little dragon goes to town on the food while Node takes a seat and starts on his own dinner. Node takes a big spoonful of the hot soup and looks pretty satisfied with how the meal turned out. The two of them finish up their dinner together, tucked away safely in their hidden little corner of the woods. Everything stays quiet under the crescent moon, with just a tiny trail of smoke drifting up into the night sky. And by the next morning, Node finds exactly what they're looking for, pointing out a massive, thick web hanging between the trees. Node looks up at the massive, white cocoons hanging from the trees and notes that this is likely where the night spider keeps its trapped prey. It's basically their storage room. He keeps moving through the thick brush with Newt, remembering how these monsters got their name because they don't kill what they catch right away, keeping them alive instead. As they creep through the clearing, Node finally spots the massive creature hunched over the ground and whispers that he found it. The two of them stay low in the tall grass, watching the spider's hairy legs move nearby as they wait for the perfect moment to jump in. Newt launches himself into the air first, a blur of scales and claws that catches the monster totally off guard. The little dragon stays agile, dodging around the spider's reach until the beast gets slammed back into its own sticky web. Node steps out and gives Newt a quick compliment for the solid teamwork, while the little dragon chirps back with plenty of energy. Node doesn't waste any more time. He lunges forward with a shout, swinging his blade in a massive arc that cuts right through the monster. Blood splatters across the forest floor as the threat is dealt with, and Node casually tells the thing goodbye. He sheathes his sword and admits that the whole thing was actually pretty easy, while Newt lets out a long, happy chirp to celebrate the win. Newt lies on the grass catching his breath after the fight, and Node thinks the little guy's diversion was actually perfect. Even if he can't fight back yet, he'll be fine as long as he keeps dodging like that. Node reaches down to give him some praise, calling his name as Newt looks up with total joy. But the peace doesn't last. Newt suddenly snaps into a growl and lets out a sharp warning just as a second, much larger spider comes screaming down from the canopy. Node yells out in pure shock as the massive creature slams into the ground right where they were standing. Node barely manages to dive out of the way, feeling the ground shake from the impact. He can't believe there's another one, but he keeps his head in the game and swings his sword to clear some room. Newt stays out in front, baring his teeth at the beast while Node tells him he's okay and thanks him for the save. He knows if Newt hadn't yelled when he did, that would have been the end of him. Node stares up at the monster looming over them. It's way bigger than the last one, and as he counts the 12 eyes on its head, he realizes he's dealing with a high-ranked version that's had plenty of time to grow. Node thinks back to when Newt was just a tiny baby wyvern fresh out of the egg. It's crazy how fast the little guy has grown since then, but he knows Newt is still just a kid who's got a long way to go before becoming a full adult. He realizes monsters are like anything else. The ones that survive the longest and get the most experience end up in a league of their own, becoming so strong they're basically a whole new species with their own scary names. Looking at the massive beast in front of him, Node realizes this isn't some normal monster. It's the biggest version of a night spider possible, known as a general spider. The monster's leg slams down like a pillar, and Node barely manages to jump back in time to avoid getting crushed by the impact. He tries to counter and swings his sword, but the blade just skips off the hard shell. He knows the hit was way too shallow to do any real damage. The spider is moving way faster than something that big should be able to, jumping around the clearing and forcing Node to stay on the move just to stay alive. It looms over the forest like a nightmare, watching his every move with those 12 glowing eyes while suddenly shooting out a thick spray of webbing. It catches Node right in the middle of his swing, pinning his arms and making him realize he's in serious trouble. His stance is completely broken and he can't find his footing, he's wide open, and the monster is already moving in to finish the job. The general spider slams a leg down, but Node's focus is sharp. He sees everything moving in slow motion. He stays low and moves with crazy speed, dodging the heavy strikes while leaping high into the air. He clears a massive swipe from the spider. The monster spits out a glob of nasty fluid, but Node just yells that now is the time to go all in, throwing himself forward even though the beast looks like a nightmare. It's huge, but he isn't backing off. Node charges right at the monster's face, screaming at the top of his lungs as he puts every bit of strength he has left into one massive swing. His blade slices clean through the spider's head. With the fight over, Node leans heavily on his sword, completely out of breath and hurting pretty bad. Newt flies over right away, chirping like crazy and frantically circling around him. Newt is clearly freaking out. Node just laughs and pulls the little guy in for a big hug. He starts patching himself up, saying the wounds are mostly just some bruises and small cuts, and then he wraps his side with bandages. Node finishes tightening the bandages around his waist, thinking to himself that even though that spider took a chunk out of him, he'll heal up just fine and clenches his fist as he feels a surge of confidence. He can tell he's definitely getting stronger after a fight like that, so a few days go by and it's finally time for him to head out. He meets up with Johan and his wife one last time in the field to show them the massive haul he got. Johan's wife can't believe how big the monster parts are, and when Node mentions it's actually 2 whole spiders, she's completely floored. Johan reaches out and tells Node he looks exhausted, suggesting he should just stay the night instead of leaving right away. Node starts to say he shouldn't, but he eventually gives in and tells them he'd really appreciate the place to stay. Johan's wife looks happy that he's sticking around for a bit longer, leading to a nice dinner before Node finally collapses into bed. He's totally wiped out and Newt is already fast asleep right on his stomach. The next morning, Node stands by his carriage getting ready to head back. Johan's wife asks if he really has to leave so soon, but Node explains that since he's still just an apprentice, he has to get back to his duties. As the carriage starts moving, she waves and reminds him about the winter festival, telling him he's welcome back whenever he wants. Node waves back with Newt flying alongside him as they head toward the royal capital. Once he gets into the city, he stops at a workshop and drops his busted armor on the counter, asking the smith if it's even possible to fix it. The blacksmith looks over the busted gear and says it's not impossible to fix, but the damage is so bad it's going to cost a fortune, and Node thinks about how much he liked that set. But he realizes his own growth is outstripping his equipment, and decides it's finally time for something new. The smith asks what could have possibly wrecked his gear this badly, and Node just casually mentions he went up against a general spider, causing the man to yell that Node is lucky to even be alive before telling him to show off the materials he managed to bring back. Looking over the estimate, Node realizes the reward from Johan won't even cover the bill, but he knows he can't put a price on his life, so the blacksmith tells him it'll take some time, but promises to make it his top priority as soon as he clears his current rush orders. Node notices the whole workshop is in a total frenzy with workers shouting for materials and the smith losing his temper at the chaos. And turns out it's because military exercises have lords from all over flooding the capital with orders. So Node tells him he's fine with the wait. Moving on, he stops by the Adventurers Guild to settle his business, and the receptionist hands him the paperwork for the material buyout. Node takes one look at the total and asks if there's a mistake, since he used so many parts for his own gear that he expected the payout to be way smaller. The receptionist tells Node the amount is right, and explains that material prices are spiking because of the military drills, leaving Node looking at the massive payout and thinking that even though the drills delayed his armor, the extra cash is a pretty good silver lining. Things take a turn when Alex shows up panicking with the ledger, and Node yells out, asking what the hell is happening to the family budget. He demands to know why they're struggling again, especially since they were finally making progress on the debt, but Alex just explains that those same drills drove food prices way up, making Node realize those military exercises are ruining him in more ways than one. Moving on to training, Walter suddenly lunges in with a serious attack, catching Node off guard with how fast he moves. Walter leaps through the air to keep the pressure on. Node barely manages to get his sword up in time to block the heavy strike. The two of them lock blades for a second before Node manages to shove him off and slide back to reset his stance, but the instructor calls the session to an end right then, causing both of them to pull back and lower their weapons immediately. Node gasps out a thanks for the help. He's completely out of breath and leaning on his sword, while Walter looks like he could go all day. Walter smiles to himself after the session. He's genuinely impressed that Node managed to land a solid hit, thinking the kid really takes after his father Albert. As Walter walks off, Node is still in the back trying to breathe. Asking if he said something, Walter just replies that the last 2 months of training clearly weren't a waste of time. Then Walter drops the big news that it's finally time to start the actual Dragon Knight training, which makes Node light up as he yells out a huge thank you. Later that evening, Node is heading through town in a carriage, feeling a bit annoyed that it's gotten so late even though his new armor is finally ready to go. He's sitting there thinking about Elsa and how she's actually a decent person despite everything. But then he hears something strange coming from outside, making him spot a shady guy in a hood just hanging out in the shadows of a nearby alley. The whole vibe of the area feels completely off. Node's first instinct is to just let the city guards deal with any drama, but then he hears someone desperately screaming for help, which immediately catches his attention. He can't just ignore it. He stops the carriage and tells them to wait right there while he heads off into the dark to see what's going on. A scarred-up thug blocks his path and laughs, telling Node that they're busy using this spot and that he should probably just keep walking if he knows what's good for him. Node doesn't even blink. He just gives the guy a cold look and tells him he's only saying it once. The guy is in his way and he needs to move right now. Node doesn't waste any time. He lunges in and drops the lead thug with a heavy hit to the face, leaving the guy reeling and screaming about what a bastard Node is. But his tough act is already falling apart. The thug starts yelling for someone to help him, but Node just watches him calmly, thinking it's time to wrap this up. It's over in a flash. Node stands there over a pile of unconscious guys while the girl he saved watches from the ground, and she finally finds her voice, speaking up to tell him how much she appreciates him stepping in like that. She introduces herself as Elisha, sounding super formal as she thanks him again for saving her from the group. Node checks to see if she's hurt and asks if those guys were just trying to rob her, but she looks away and explains she's actually with the Magic Academy, and she's pretty sure someone hired those thugs specifically to harass her. Node suggests he could probably beat the truth out of them, but Elisha says it's pointless since they're just low-level hired muscle. He figures they should at least tie the guys up and offers to go find some rope, but Elisha tells him to wait. Node looks back at Elisha and asks her what's wrong. Noticing she's stopped in her tracks, she looks down and says she can actually create the rope they need herself. Before Node can react, Elisha pulls some magic together and the street under her starts to crack. The ground bursts open and she pulls heavy iron chains right out of the broken pavement. Node says he's honestly surprised by that, so Elisha hands the chains over and tells him it's just alchemy. But Node points out that wrecking the public road is a huge problem. The guards eventually show up to take the thugs away, thanking the two of them for the help. Node mentions it's a good thing they fixed the street before the knights saw it, while Elisha thanks him again, and Node suggests walking her to the main road so she stays safe. Elisha agrees and thanks him one more time as a carriage rolls past them down the street. Node stands out in the quiet city street at night, telling someone they just need to hang on a little bit longer, while the blacksmith explains that spider parts are actually pretty interesting to work with because if you polish the shell right, it turns hard as metal and the skin gets smooth. Node looks down at his new gear, realizing this is finally his new armor, but he's a little confused because the design doesn't look like what he expected. So the blacksmith tells him that since he's officially a knight now, he styled the set to look like real knight equipment as a free service. Later on, Node shows the new outfit to his family and asks them what they think, and everyone just stands there completely stunned by the transformation. His mother starts crying into her handkerchief because she's so proud, and even Alec can't help but lose it, saying he never thought he'd see the day Node looked like a true knight. She immediately starts planning a huge celebration to mark the occasion, but Node starts panicking and tells her and Alec to slow down for a second. His older brother Albero walks up and puts a hand on his shoulder, mentioning how happy their mother must be, and Node turns to see him standing there, as Albero explains that she always felt bad about the weight she put on his shoulders, and she's probably just relieved to see him doing so well. Just as they're talking, someone waves from across the way and yells out for their brother, catching Node's eye and making him turn around. Ellen gets super hyped up seeing the new gear, shouting about how cool her big brother looks in his armor. Node thinks back to when he was just a little kid, remembering how much he looked up to his dad and brothers when they were geared up, so he looks up at the stars and quietly thanks Ellen for saying that. Back at training, Rena notices the upgrade and tells Node he finally looks like a real knight, but then he cracks a joke about how even a regular guy looks good in nice clothes, which Node doesn't really take as a compliment. The mood shifts as things start getting a bit loud and chaotic on the training grounds, leading to Rena calling out for instructor Arons to come check out the new look, and the instructor actually admits the armor is pretty solid. Node says thanks, but then Arons gets this scary look on his face, saying he's going to make sure Node's skills actually match the quality of the gear, making the kid lose it as the training turns brutal. Later on, Node is standing there totally drained and wrapped in a cloak, and the research professor mentions how it looks like he got worked over again. Node asks what she needs, and she apologizes for the random timing, but asks if he wouldn't mind running a quick errand for her, and he says he's down for it. Just then, Newt looks up at him with those big eyes, making a cute little sound like he wants to tag along. A man with long hair looks down, looking pretty stressed as he whispers the name of the Magical Institute. Node finally makes it to the front of the massive stone building, taking a second to realize he's actually at the institute. This place is the main academic hub in the capital, focusing on everything from high-level magic to basic technology, but it's not exactly a friendly spot for outsiders. Standing there wrapped in his cloak, Node can already tell that the vibe here is super exclusive and cold, making him witness some guy getting yelled at and kicked out of the building. The poor dude just apologizes while running for it, and as the door slams shut, Node just stands there trying to figure out how he's supposed to handle this. But then Elisha shows up out of nowhere. She recognizes him right away, and Node is totally shocked to see her at a place like this. He explains that he's got a letter for instructor Layson and asks if she knows the way. She offers to guide him, and Node tells her that's a huge help. They reach a room filled with old books and gear where Node lets himself in, apologizing for the interruption as he calls out for the instructor. The old man with the long beard turns around and completely loses it, yelling at Node the second he sees his face. Layson starts yelling the second they walk in, making it clear he isn't taking on any new students no matter how many times they show up, which completely catches Elisha off guard. So she quickly tries to explain that Node is just there on official business from the research facility. Node keeps it professional and introduces himself as a messenger, hoping to calm the old man down. Layson seems surprised to hear about the facility and stops shouting long enough for Node to offer him the document he's carrying. The instructor takes the paper and starts looking it over immediately, and once he's done, he tosses a heavy bundle back at Node. He tells the kid it's fine, and to just make sure this gets back to a guy named Eric, Node just nods and gets shoved right out the door. Layson yells after him that Eric needs to stop being an idiot and show his own face around there next time, leaving Node standing in the hallway looking pretty confused. He tells Elisha he can't believe he just got kicked out like that, but she looks pretty guilty about the whole thing. She apologizes, explaining that Layson has a habit of rejecting anyone who wants to be his apprentice, so he probably thought Node was just another student. As they walk, Node asks if she's actually an alchemist after seeing her use those chains earlier. Elisha tells him she actually focuses on enchantments and physical magic, but she's also working on mastering attack spells, making Node realize she's way more talented than she looks. He thinks to himself that being able to handle 3 different types of magic is honestly amazing. Elisha beams with a ton of pride, telling Node that she's actually got a lot of confidence when it comes to her magic skills, and Node can't help but be impressed. He thinks that for him, that level of skill would be like mastering the sword, spear, and bow all at once. He knows he's still basically a rookie with a spear, so seeing someone so talented makes him realize how far he has to go. Node asks if enchantment magic is what they use for things like magic swords, and Elisha tells him he's spot on. She points out a nearby lamp, explaining that even something simple like that is an enchantment, because it uses magic circles drawn inside to pull power from magic stones, which is what keeps it running. She mentions that her real dream is to research and build magic tools like that. And just then, Node gets an idea as Elisha turns to him with a big smile and asks if he wants to come back to her room, since she has something she wants to give him. But right as they're moving, she loses her balance and trips over her own feet, letting out a yell while Node jumps into action. He catches her from behind before she can hit the floor, though he looks pretty surprised by how fast it happened. He tells her she's got to start looking where she's going and asks if she's okay to stand back up. So Elisha just blushes, looking completely embarrassed as she quietly thanks him for the save. Node looks at Elisha and can't help but think she reminds him of his younger siblings back home. Then he realizes that her red hair is probably why. Elisha seems a bit caught off guard by the comment and mentions that her mom is actually the one with red hair. So as they keep walking through the halls, she notices that Node is wearing different armor than the last time she saw him. She holds out a wrapped gift and tells him to take it, explaining it's a magic tool that uses fire magic, which catches Node completely off guard. He knows magic tools are incredibly expensive. A weapon like this could easily be worth dozens of silver coins, a price he can't even imagine. Elisha insists it's just her way of saying thanks for him helping her out, so Node decides to stop worrying and accepts the gift. She warns him that since the blade is made of magic stone, it gets smaller every time it's used. It's just a prototype with low durability, so it only has about 3 uses left. She tells him all he has to do is grip the handle and say the word Ignis. And Node almost tests it out right there. Elisha completely loses it and yells at him to stop before he burns the whole room down, making him quickly apologize. She reminds him to be careful since it launches a fireball the size of his torso, one direct hit, and the explosion will completely wrap around the target. As they walk away, Node thinks to himself that with a tool like this, he could probably take out a crystal rank monster in a single shot. Node looks at the magic tool and tells Elisha that it feels like way too much for a thank you gift, but he makes sure to tell her that if she ever runs into trouble, he's got her back. Elisha looks down and gets a bit shy, admitting that since he mentioned it, she actually does have something on her mind that's been bothering her. She explains that for a commoner like her, it's almost impossible to find a master magic user to take her as an apprentice since she has 0 connection. She needs a teacher with a master title to even get into the Magic Institute. And Node listens while they walk, eventually asking her how she's actually doing in her classes and what her grades look like. Elisha doesn't miss a beat and tells him that she's actually been the top student in her entire class, which completely catches Node off guard. He stops and asks her with a shocked look just how old she really is. She tells him she's only 14, mentioning that most of her classmates are actually Node's age or even in their 20s, leaving Node thinking he's dealing with a literal genius. This place is the Royal Magic Academy, the absolute best of the best when it comes to learning magic in the whole kingdom, so it's full of students who show up with massive egos and think they're the best thing ever. But Elisha is on a whole different level, showing off talent that's way beyond anyone else her age. Node can't help but wonder what people would think if they saw how talented Elisha really is, especially since he's pretty sure the guy who sent those thugs after her was just jealous of her skills. Elisha mentions she's trying to sell her own magic tools to build up a name for herself so she can finally get an apprenticeship. But she admits the real problem is that she can't get the materials she needs, like spirit crystals. Node knows those are insanely expensive because spirit crystals are special magic stones that hold the actual power of a spirit. You only get them from the cores of really strong spirits after you take them down, which is a huge problem because once a spirit decides they don't like you, they can wreck everything in sight. Node remembers the old saying about never waking a sleeping dragon or a spirit, so he looks totally stressed and tells her that even though he wants to help, no amount of lives would be enough to survive hunting those things. Elisha just smiles and tells him not to worry, explaining that the prototype he gave her actually helped her figure out how to get enough power even from cheap, low-grade stones. Because of that, she asks if Node might have a lead on where she could find a fire-type magic crystal through his adventure contacts. Node thinks it over, realizing he's only ever found ice spirit stones before, and he starts wondering how he's going to pull this off for her, especially since these crystals, often called spirit tears, only show up in spots where magic is thick and the spirits are at their strongest. It's common knowledge that ice spirit tears are only found on snowy mountains in the dead of winter, while water spirit tears are hidden deep in lakes or the sea. Thunder spirit tears only show up where lightning strikes the earth, and as far as anyone knows, fire spirit tears are strictly found in active volcanoes. Meaning, Node tells Elisha that the nearest volcano is across the border, and a round trip would take at least 2 months, way too far for him to go himself. Elisha looks pretty let down by the news. She laughs it off though, saying she doesn't have the money anyway. Since she mostly just spends her time copying borrowed textbooks, she barely makes any profit at all, so the most she can really offer him is to make another magic tool like the one she already gave him. Node just stands there with his jaw dropped, barely able to process what she's saying. He looks at her with a mix of confusion and total disbelief, wondering if he heard her right. Node leans in close, looking completely serious as he asks her to repeat exactly what she just said. Elisha smiles and explains that since she's planning on getting extra spirit tears anyway, she can make him as many of those magic tools as he wants, like it's no big deal. Node looks at the tool in his hand, sweating as the realization hits him. He can't believe she has absolutely no idea how insanely valuable and rare her work actually is. The hall is loud and full of people, but Node just stands there. Node hears someone calling his name and looks over to see Zinnius waving him down, yelling for him to come join the rest of the old crew at the tavern. Jagos is busy eating while Shino and Almina wait at the table. Shino gets all excited when she realizes it's actually Node, and Almina mentions how it's been way too long since they last hung out. She's already mid-drink and tells him she heard the big news about him joining the Night Order. Shino tells him he needs to show his face more often, which leads to a little bickering between the girls while Jagos just chugs his beer. He eventually stops to tell Node he's looking really healthy and solid. Zinnius puts a hand on Node's shoulder and tells the group he's gonna borrow their friend for a minute. Jagos tells them to make it quick, since the whole point of today is celebrating their promotion to Red Copper rank. Node looks at their new adventure tags and realizes that even with all his intense training, his friends are still moving up the ranks faster than he is. As the group splits up, a voice from the back asks Node if he's doing all right. Zinnius looks serious, telling Jagos he's leaving the rest of the party to him for a bit before the scene shifts to the quiet night sky, where the stars are out and everything feels much more private. Node pulls out a weapon and tells Zinnius to check out this magic sword. Zinnius looks like he's seeing a ghost, sweating as he takes the blade in his hand. He asks if this is really a high-level magic tool for combat, since stuff like this is basically impossible for regular people to find, but Node just keeps a straight face. He asks Zinnius what he'd do if he could actually get him a meeting with the mage who crafted the thing, and Zinnius absolutely loses it. He screams at Node, asking if he's for real and what the catch is. He begs for an introduction, dying to know what kind of mage could even pull that off. Node explains that she's a genius who can use 3 types of magic, though he warns Zinnius that she's actually kind of dangerous because she had zero clue how valuable her work really was. In a flashback, Elisha looks confused while Node remembers how she lived without understanding that her skills were a gold mine. Node recalls telling her that if she ever offered magic tools as a reward for a job, adventurers would line up to help her for free, and the memory ends with Elisha looking hyped. She says she's going to go post a request immediately, leaving Node to realize just how easy she is too. Zinnius admits he had to step in and stop her before things got way out of hand. Node just sighs, mentioning that the girl's total lack of common sense is actually kind of scary, and Zinnius explains how mages usually work. They hate the idea of money controlling their craft. Since magic is a talent they take pride in, they usually won't even talk to someone unless they actually respect them, so he guesses that based on her vibe, there's no way she's registered with the guild. Node confirms he's right, which brings up a huge problem because the guild is the only thing that keeps adventurers safe with rules and protection. Without that backup, a person is basically standing alone in the dark with nothing to stop the wrong people from coming after them. Zinnius warns that if word gets out about Elisha, she won't just be dealing with curious researchers. She could literally be kidnapped or locked up by someone dangerous and forced to churn out magic tools like a machine just to make some creep rich. Node remembers scaring her with these exact facts, and Zinnius asks if he really laid it all out for her like that. Node nods, admitting that while she definitely understood the danger, he might have gone a bit too far with the threats considering her past. Her parents were just farmers who died when she was young, and she didn't even start school until she was 12, so she never really had a chance to learn the ropes. Node realizes that since they can't post a secret request through the guild, Zinnius's party is the only group he can actually trust with this. Zinnius finally sees the full picture and locks in with a serious look. He asks Node to give him the real details on what this specific job is going to involve. Zinnius lays out the mission. They're heading to a volcano area to gather tears from fire spirits. He says Node can get the full story from the client later, but the real pay is that they get to keep any extra magic tools made from the crystals, which is better than nothing since Zinnius warns him not to expect any actual cash for this run. Node stares at the crystals and asks if there are any other specific rules he needs to follow. And Zinnius is dead serious about one thing: Node can't ever reveal where the tools or the mage came from. He knows adventurers love to gossip, and Node realizes that if people found out, it would just turn into one giant headache for everyone, so Node finally agrees to the deal. But he stops for a second because he's got one more thing he needs to ask. He wants to know why Zinnius is putting in all this effort for a mage when he isn't even making a profit as the middleman. It seems like a lot of work for no gain, but Zinnius just shrugs it off, mentioning he already got paid way too much for helping Node out with those thugs a while back. Node isn't buying it though, so he eventually comes clean, blushing a bit while he scratches his head. He admits Elisha reminds him way too much of his younger sibling, and he just couldn't help but look after her. Zinnius just laughs and tells him he hasn't changed a bit before dragging him off, saying the first round of drinks is on him tonight. Later on, Node heads back to see Elisha, who's waiting at the door looking totally hyped. She asks if he managed to settle the deal and tells him he's got to come inside so they can talk. Node notices she looks completely exhausted and asks if she's even okay, but she just says she stayed up all night working and stumbles off to make some tea. Node's walking through the house when he notices the door to the back room is wide open. He points it out to Elisha, who's busy getting the tea ready. She asks him what he's looking at, but then she follows his eyes and sees her bedroom door is open, showing a white cloth draped over the bed. Elisha completely loses it, her face turning bright red as she realizes Node just saw her underwear. She lunges across the room to slam the door shut while Node just stands there looking confused, but then she gets right in his face, looking super suspicious as she asks him what exactly he saw. Node plays it safe and asks if that white fabric was just some kind of magic material. Elisha just stares at him for a second, totally stunned that he's actually buying that. She rolls with it immediately, laughing nervously while explaining that it's a super rare material she doesn't like showing off, so Node buys the excuse and apologizes for peeking into her bedroom. He feels pretty bad about the whole thing, and the atmosphere in the room gets incredibly awkward. He starts looking around for anything else to focus on, and then he asks if he can check out a book on legendary monsters. Elisha tells him it's fine, just relieved the conversation is finally moving on. Elisha finishes stirring the tea and mentions she actually hand-copied that entire book herself because she was so interested in the subject. And as she points out the entries for legendary monsters like Fenrir and Sky Dragons, she asks Node if he ever dreams of fighting things like that. Node looks at the drawings of the massive beasts and admits he wouldn't say no to the idea, but realistically, he'd rather just pass on that. He tells her that most of those things are probably just made up anyway, but Elisha stops him right there, explaining that there are actually plenty of ancient records that prove these monsters are real. She starts flipping through the pages to find a specific example for him, eventually landing on a page about the Empress Spider, which gets Node's attention immediately as he realizes the name sounds familiar. Elisha tells him he's probably thinking of the raw silk that gets imported from the East, because back when legendary adventurers were still around, they used to call that silk Arachne's thread. Node points out that she's talking about stuff from hundreds of years ago, so Elisha just gives him a flat stare and asks if he thinks she's lying to him. Node doesn't really have an answer for that one. Node tells Elisha that he gets she isn't joking around, but the whole thing is still pretty hard to wrap his head around. Elisha insists the info is legit, explaining how she found the details in an old document while she was stuck organizing the Magic Academy's archives. Node asks why she'd even be doing a boring job like that, so she explains the academy has a program to help students who are low on cash, and making hand copies of books was just part of the deal. She starts looking around for the specific copy she made, leaving Node sitting there with his tea while she rummages through her stuff, nearly knocking things over before finally announcing that she found exactly what she was looking for. She drops the books on the table and mentions the original text was falling apart, but she managed to translate the parts about the Empress Spider's traits and how that legendary thread is made, which really gets to Node. He just leans over the table, wondering if creatures that scary are actually wandering around the continent. Elisha asks for his take on it, suggesting that maybe adventurers from the old days just hunted them into extinction since nobody has seen one in centuries. Node says he hopes that's true, but the book says something different. It claims the queen is only born during times of massive, violent war. Node realizes there was a huge war just over 10 years ago, and since no spider showed up then, he figures Elisha might be right about them being gone, until something suddenly pops into his head. Elisha suddenly realizes she missed something important. Admitting she totally forgot to bring up the request from the adventurer's, Node closes his book and remembers the topic, asking her what the deal is with that guy Zinnius since the whole favor really helped him out, and he makes sure to thank her for taking care of the errand while wyverns fly over the city. Elisha starts rummaging through the shelves again and asks if he's actually friends with Instructor Layson. She mentions the old guy told her Node needs to show up in person next time, and he even called her by her name. Node just laughs it off while looking at the desk, telling her he's sorry she had to take the heat and get yelled at instead of him. Elisha explains that the instructor was actually her master back when she was still at the Magic Academy, but she ended up leaving because she was sick of the place, which makes things pretty awkward now. She leans her head on the table and tells Node he probably noticed it himself, but the academy is a super closed-off and exclusive kind of environment, leaving Node thinking back to the cold stares he got from the other mages. He realizes they definitely weren't being friendly and wonders if Elisha is just different from the rest of them. It turns out that even though it's supposed to be a place for research, the whole institution is really just a mess of people fighting for power and living in a world where who you know is way more important than how good you actually are. But Instructor Layson was different, staying neutral and being one of the only decent people there. The research professor looks down, getting a bit serious as she mentions a certain mage she used to know. She keeps busy erasing the chalkboard while explaining that the person came from a commoner background and tried to build a reputation through making magic tools. The sound of the eraser hitting the board fills the room, and she says pretty bluntly that it's most likely a lost cause. Node clenches his fist, clearly feeling for the person she's talking about, and asks her why it has to be that way. She explains that Instructor Layson only gets to stay neutral because he comes from a big-shot family, whereas a mage with no backing or friends is just a burden in their constant power games. As she finishes cleaning the board, she tells him that's the exact reason why no one is willing to take on an apprentice like that. Node starts to argue that things might be different if they could just show some real results, but the professor turns to him and says she hates to be the one to tell him this. She looks him right in the face and points out that every single person who actually earns the title of instructor was called a genius at least once in their life. She admits the kid has a rare level of talent, but tells Node that people like that have definitely shown up before. And as wyverns fly over the city outside, she drops the bombshell that she was the one who earned her instructor title when she was only 18 years old. Elisha has a huge smile on her face, telling Node that she's honestly just really happy they managed to become friends, but back in the present, Node watches Newt and worries about what he can even do to help Elisha if her plan to find a magic master fails, all while the rain starts coming down hard outside. When they finally get back, Alec the butler greets Node at the door but immediately gets worried seeing the state his master is in. Node is totally wiped out and soaking wet, telling Alec he needs a break before he catches a cold, so the butler head off to get a hot bath ready for him. Node lets out a big sigh about what a rough day it was and calls Newt over to get him cleaned up too. The little dragon nuzzles right up against Node's chest, looking totally happy to be back home in the warmth. Node starts drying him off with a towel, making sure to get all the rainwater off his back and wings. He tells Newt to spread his wings out wide so he can finish the job, and the little guy chirps while shaking the water off. Once he's all dry, Newt curls up on a soft mat to rest, looking a lot better than he did out in the storm. Alec comes back into the room with some fresh herbal tea, and Node tells him it's a huge help as he relaxes and plays around with Newt on the floor. Alec mentions there's actually one more thing he needs to tell him, catching Node's attention as the two of them head to the baths where the kids are already playing around. The girls show off their toy duck to Node, and he tells them they're doing a great job before reminding everyone to just take it easy and soak for a while. After they get out, Node helps dry off his little sisters while Alec stands by to help out, Later that night, Node gets a chance to sit down and open a new letter from Johan addressed specifically to him. Johan writes that because Node took out the general spider a few months ago, the locals can finally hunt and gather food in the forest again. And even though the weirdly cold summer ruined some of the crops, it looks like the village is actually going to survive the winter this time. Node thinks it's great that his brother is doing well, especially since Johan says he's always welcome to come back for another visit, which makes Newt chirp happily from the floor. But then Node notices a little extra note at the bottom of the page that says a wyvern has apparently set up a nest over in the eastern mountain. Johan explains that while nobody has been hurt yet, everyone in the area is pretty much terrified of what might happen. Johan makes sure to add that he isn't asking Node to go deal with it, but Node just stares at the word wyvern like it's the only thing he can see. Node gets a knock on the door letting him know dinner is ready, and just then Newt's stomach starts growling like crazy. He finishes up what he's doing and yells back that he's on his way, and then he calls out to Newt to get moving so they can eat. The little guy chirps happily and follows him out, leaving the dragons flying high over the academy buildings while the sun shines down on another busy day. Later on, Node shows up at the office and asks Instructor Arons if he needed to see him. Arons is sitting behind a massive mountain of paperwork and tells Node his training is officially on hold. Node can't help but think he's heard this exact same thing before. And before he can say anything, Rena jumps out of nowhere and starts crying, grabbing Node's shirt and begging for help with the endless work. Arons tells Rena to stop bothering the rookie and act like a senior, so Node asks what's actually going on with all this mess. Arons explains that the top brass decided to massively expand the Dragon Knights to finally end the border war that's been going on for years. Turns out the paperwork is killing everyone, so Node asks exactly how many more knights they're planning to add to their current group of 40. Node looks at the room full of supplies and thinks to himself that realistically, the number of new recruits should be pretty small. He asks Arons if they're looking at maybe 5 more riders, but Arons just holds up his hand and tells him no, and then Arons says the real number is 50. Node's jaw hits the floor as he stutters out the number, totally shocked by the scale. Arons explains they'll do it in stages, so Node asks if a massive expansion like that is even a good idea, but it turns out taming dragons usually requires rare high-level knights, and taking them from other units would wreck the country's defense. Rena just cheers in the background, telling Node to keep things casual between them. Arons tells Node he's actually the one who fixed the whole situation. Node points to himself, completely confused about how he helped, and so Arons points out that normally these dragons don't like people at all. It takes someone like Rena to force them into line, but Node stumbled onto a much better way by total accident while he was holding Newt. He explains that by using the mother scent to trick a hatchling into imprinting, literally anyone can become a dragon rider, which means they don't have to waste their best knights or worry about the military getting weak. Plus, they got a huge budget boost out of the deal. Node thinks about how even as a baby, Newt eats twice as much as he does. If Newt grows to full size, the food bill alone would wreck the family budget, so he's really glad they're getting support looking at the massive amount of paperwork. Node asks if they're planning to let regular adventurers handle the egg collection. Arons rubs his chin and admits that they actually did think about going with that plan at first. Moving on, the news travels fast through the city as people start noticing the new collection requests from the Iron Dragon Knights, asking each other if they've seen the post yet. Everyone starts laughing about the fact that the eggs and dung come as a package deal now, joking about who's going to end up covered in it next. Arons looks pretty annoyed as he explains that's exactly why the idea got tossed out. Node adds that adventurers aren't exactly known for keeping their mouths shut. Arons points out that while any adventurer could technically take down a wyvern to get an egg, none of them ever would have dreamed of Node's method of just getting covered in poop. He slams his hand on the board, saying it's only a matter of time before the info leaks once rumors get out, so he's decided the Iron Dragon Knights will handle the collecting themselves. Arons leads Node over to a large map on the wall and points out the locations of all the known wyvern nests, but as Node looks closer at the marked peaks, he spots something that catches him completely off guard. Arons notices Node just standing there staring at the map and asks him what's up. Node points right at the eastern mountain range. He tells Arons that wyverns have set up a nest there, and he only knows because his brother just sent him a letter about it. It's the freshest info they've got, but Node's face goes totally serious as he explains why this is a disaster. That spot used to be right on the border and it's full of really high-quality mining spots. So Arons gets the picture immediately, pointing out that if those wyverns start attacking the horses carrying